Samuel Grant had sworn he'd never touch another woman after burying his wife 15 years ago. But when a stranger appeared at his fence claiming to be his mail-order bride, a bride he never ordered, everything changed. She'd traveled 1,000 miles on a forged letter, abandoned everything for a lie. He should have sent her away. Instead, the storm came and he let her in. That single choice would resurrect a heart he thought was dead. This is their story. Stay until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The Utah Territory in 1884 was a land that didn't forgive weakness. It carved men into stone and women into ghosts, and Samuel Grant had become both. 15 years he'd worked this ranch alone. 15 years since the telegram came, telling him his bride-to-be had died in a hospital overseas before they could marry. 15 years of silence so deep it had become another resident of the property, settling into the corners of rooms and the spaces between fence posts. The morning she arrived, Samuel was mending the north fence line, the same stretch he'd been working on for 3 days. The wood was stubborn, rotted through in places where the winter had been particularly cruel. His hands moved with mechanical precision. Hammer, nail, test the board, move to the next. The repetition was meditation, the only kind of prayer he allowed himself anymore. He didn't hear her approach at first. The wind was picking up from the west, carrying the smell of snow from the mountains, and it masked the sound of footsteps on the muddy road. When he finally looked up, she was standing there at the gate, swaying slightly like a willow in a storm. She was a ruin of a woman. That was his first thought. Her traveling dress, which might have once been a respectable brown, was now the color of the road itself, caked in mud up to her knees. Her bonnet hung askew, revealing dark hair that had escaped its pins and now clung to her face in damp strands. Her boots, what he could see of them, were barely holding together, the leather split along one side. But it was her face that stopped him, pale as milk, with shadows under her eyes so dark they looked like bruises. She gripped the fence post as if it were the only thing keeping her upright, and when she spoke, her voice was raw, like she'd been screaming or crying or both. "Mr. Grant? Mr. Samuel Grant?" He set down his hammer slowly, studying her. "That's me." "I'm Clara Whitmore." She paused, and something flickered across her face. Hope? Fear? Defiance? He couldn't tell. "I'm your mail-order bride." The words hung in the air between them, absurd and impossible. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. "My what?" Her hand trembled as she reached into the pocket of her coat and pulled out a letter. The paper was wrinkled and stained, folded and refolded so many times the creases had begun to tear. She held it out to him through the fence rails. "This," she said, "your letter. You wrote to the agency in St. Louis 6 months ago. You paid for my passage. I've been traveling for 3 weeks to get here." Samuel took the letter, his fingers numb despite the work gloves. He unfolded it carefully, and there it was, his name at the bottom, Samuel Grant, in a hand that was definitely not his own. The words above it were formal, sterile. "Seeking a woman of good character for marriage and companionship. Ranch in Utah Territory. Hard work but honest living. Must be willing to face frontier conditions." He read it twice, then looked up at her. "I didn't write this." The color drained from her face, what little was left. "What?" "This isn't my handwriting. I never wrote to any agency." He handed the letter back to her. "Someone's played you false, Miss Whitmore." She stared at the letter in her hands as if it had transformed into a snake. Her lips moved, forming words that didn't come out. Then she looked up at the sky, at the mountains, at the fence, at anything but him. "I see," she finally said. Her voice was empty now, hollowed out. "I left everything. My position, my room, everything I owned except what I could carry. I spent every penny I had on the train fare. The agency told me it was all arranged, that you'd paid, that there was a home waiting." Samuel felt an uncomfortable twist in his gut. "The agency took your money?" "They said it was for processing fees, documentation." She laughed, a bitter sound. "I suppose it was all a scheme then. The letter, the whole thing." She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket with movements that were too careful, too controlled. A woman holding herself together by sheer will. Samuel knew that particular kind of breaking, the kind where you couldn't afford to crack, not yet, not until you were alone. Well, she said, straightening her shoulders, thank you for your honesty, Mr. Grant. I apologize for the intrusion. She turned to go, and Samuel watched her take 3 steps back down the muddy road before something made him speak. Storm's coming. She stopped but didn't turn around. Big one, by the look of those clouds. Be here in an hour, maybe less. You won't make it back to town before it hits. I'll manage, she said. Millwater's 8 miles. Road'll be impassable once the rain starts, and if it turns to snow up higher, you'll freeze before you get halfway. Now she did turn, and he saw the pride warring with desperation in her face. I won't impose on you, Mr. Grant. You've made it clear I'm not wanted here. Didn't say that. He picked up his hammer, turning back to the fence. Said I didn't order a bride, but I'm not fool enough to send a woman out into a storm. There's a spare room. You'll sleep by the stove tonight, eat a hot meal, and when the weather clears tomorrow, I'll drive you to town myself. I have no money to pay you. Didn't ask for any. She was silent for a long moment. He could feel her studying him, weighing options she probably didn't have. Just tonight, she finally said. Just tonight, he agreed, though something in his chest told him it was a lie, even as he said it. Bossum. The ranch house was exactly what Clara had expected, and nothing like it at the same time. It was sturdy, built from thick logs that had weathered into a silver gray. A stone chimney rose from the center, currently sending up a thin trail of smoke. The porch sagged slightly on one side, but looked functional. It was a working ranch house, practical and plain. But inside, it was a tomb. The first thing that struck her was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of a well-kept home, but the oppressive hush of a place where no one spoke, where no life happened beyond the bare necessities of survival. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. A large iron stove dominated one corner, radiating welcome heat. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat near the window. A single armchair faced the fireplace, worn in the exact shape of the man who sat in it. But what made her breath catch were the things that weren't there. No curtains on the windows, just bare glass staring out at the landscape. No rugs on the floor, just scarred wood. No pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves, no signs that a human being with a soul lived here. It was a structure, not a home. Samuel moved through the space with the efficiency of a man who'd performed these actions 10,000 times. He stirred the stove, added wood, pumped water into a kettle and set it to boil. His movements were economical, not a single wasted gesture. Spare rooms through there, he said, nodding toward a door on the far wall. Door locks from the inside, clean sheets on the bed. You can wash up if you like. There's a basin and pitcher. Thank you. Clara wasn't sure what else to say. She felt like a ghost, insubstantial and out of place. Stew will be ready in an hour. Not fancy, but it's hot. She nodded and retreated to the spare room, closing the door behind her with a sense of relief so profound it almost brought tears. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a dresser, a chair by the single window. Like the rest of the house, it was functional and utterly impersonal. Clara sat on the bed and finally let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. She'd left St. Louis 3 weeks ago with such hope. The position she'd held as a domestic servant had been bearable at best, degrading at worst. When Mrs. Henderson's son had started finding excuses to corner her in empty rooms, Clara had known she needed to leave. The advertisement for the mail-order bride agency had seemed like providence, a chance to start over, to have something of her own, to matter to someone. She'd saved for 6 months to afford the agency fee. She'd spent her last wages on a decent traveling dress and sturdy boots. She'd written letters to Mr. Samuel Grant, and someone had written back. The responses had been brief but kind, talking about the ranch, the territory, the life they might build together. All lies, all of it. Clara pressed her hands against her face, feeling the grit of 3 weeks' travel on her skin. She wouldn't cry. She'd learned long ago that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. Tomorrow she'd go to town, find work somehow, start again. She'd done it before. She'd do it again. A knock on the door made her jump. "Food's ready?" Samuel's voice came through the wood, already retreating. The stew was simple: beef, potatoes, carrots, onions. But it was the best thing Clara had tasted in weeks. Railroad food had been scarce and expensive, and she'd rationed what little she had. Now she ate with single-minded focus, barely aware of Samuel sitting across from her doing the same. It was only when she'd finished and looked up that she realized he'd been watching her, not in a threatening way, but with a kind of puzzlement, as if she were a problem he was trying to solve. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday morning. Some bread and cheese." He stood and ladled more stew into her bowl without asking. "Eat." They finished the meal in silence. When Clara offered to wash the dishes, Samuel shook his head. "You've traveled 3 weeks and been on your feet all day. Rest." But she couldn't rest, couldn't sit still with the weight of her failure pressing down on her, so she stood and began clearing the table anyway, moving around him to the pump and basin. "Miss Whitmore, Clara, please." "Miss Whitmore is what Mrs. Henderson called me when she was displeased." She pumped water into the basin, her movements sharp. "And that was most of the time." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Your last employer." "Yes." She scrubbed a bowl with more force than necessary. "I was in service there for 4 years. It was a respectable position, or so everyone said. Good wages, room and board, only occasional beatings when things went missing that I hadn't taken." The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She usually kept those feelings locked away, where they couldn't hurt anyone, especially herself. "Her son?" Samuel asked quietly. Claire's hand stilled in the water. "What about him?" "You said you left everything, but the way you said it, you weren't leaving for something better. You were running from something worse." She resumed scrubbing, not looking at him. "Mr. Henderson was 23 and believed that servant girls were part of the amenities of his mother's house. I disagreed. He was persistent. I knew it was only a matter of time before his persistence overcame my protests, and when it did, I'd be the one blamed and dismissed without references." "So you saw the agency advertisement." "I saw a chance to be something other than powerless, to have a home that couldn't be taken away on someone else's whim, to matter." She set the bowl aside and started on the next. "Foolish, I suppose. There's no such thing as safety, not for women like me." "Women like you?" "Women with nothing, no family, no money, no power. We survive on the sufferance of others, and when that sufferance runs out, we disappear." She finished the last dish and dried her hands on a towel that had seen better days. "But I won't disappear. I'll find another position in town. I'm a hard worker. Someone will need help." Samuel stood there, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Outside, the first drops of rain began to hit the windows. "Storm starting," he said. "You should sleep. Morning's soon enough to figure out what comes next." Clara nodded and retreated to the spare room, closing the door between them. She changed out of her travel-stained dress and into the only other one she owned, a simple cotton shift. The bed was harder than she was used to, but clean. The pillow smelled like soap and sunshine. She lay in the darkness, listening to the rain intensify into a roar on the roof. In the main room, she could hear Samuel moving around, banking the fire, settling in for the night. The sounds were domestic and strange at the same time. Another person in the space after so long alone. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the careful forgery, the elaborate lie. Who would do such a thing? And why? Did Samuel have enemies? Or had it truly been the agency, running some kind of elaborate scheme? But exhaustion was pulling at her now, 3 weeks of travel and stress finally catching up. Her last thought before sleep took her was of Samuel's hands on the fence post, scarred and capable, and the way he'd looked at her, not with pity or desire, but with something else. Recognition, perhaps. The kind one ghost gives another. In the main room, Samuel sat in his chair by the dying fire and stared at nothing. 15 years he'd lived alone. 15 years of silence broken only by the sounds of animals, weather, and his own breathing. He'd grown to prefer it that way. People complicated things. People asked questions, wanted things, left holes when they went away, especially women. He'd met Margaret during the war. She'd been a nurse, and he'd been a soldier with a bullet in his shoulder that had gone septic. She'd saved his life, and somehow, in the fever dreams and pain, he'd fallen in love with her. When the war ended, he'd come west to build something, to make a life worthy of her. He'd written letters, made plans. She'd said yes. Then the telegram came. Fever had taken her, quick and merciless. She died calling his name, the matron wrote. She died with his last letter clutched in her hand. Samuel had read that telegram and felt something inside him go still and cold. He'd built the ranch anyway because what else was there? Work was reliable. Land didn't leave. Animals needed feeding whether you wanted to feel or not. And now Clara Whitmore was sleeping in his spare room, brought here by a lie he didn't understand. He should let her go tomorrow, drive her to town, give her a few dollars to help her start over, forget she'd ever appeared at his fence. But something about her had cracked through his careful indifference. The way she'd stood there, destroyed but refusing to break. The pride that made her turn away even when she had nowhere to go. The bitterness in her voice when she talked about being powerless. He understood that feeling. The war had taught him what it meant to be helpless, to watch people die and be unable to stop it. He'd sworn afterward that he'd never be powerless again, never care enough about anything that losing it could destroy him. Yet here he was, troubled by a stranger's pain. Samuel stood and moved to the window. The storm was in full force now, rain sheeting down in waves, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating the mountains in the distance. The road to town would be a river of mud by morning. Even if he wanted to take her back, it wouldn't be possible for at least a day, maybe two. Which meant she'd be here, in his house, disrupting the carefully constructed emptiness he'd built over 15 years. He should be angry about that. Instead, he felt something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long he'd almost forgotten what to call it. Curious. He wanted to know who Clara Whitmore really was, why she'd been desperate enough to trust a letter from a stranger, what dreams she'd carried all the way from St. Louis, what kind of person emerged from powerlessness and survival with that particular steel in their spine. But curiosity was dangerous. Curiosity led to questions. Questions led to conversations. Conversations led to connections. And connections led to pain when they inevitably broke. Better to stay cold. Better to stay empty. Samuel returned to his chair and closed his eyes, trying to summon the numbness that usually came so easily. But tonight it wouldn't come. Tonight he kept seeing Clara's face when he'd told her he hadn't written the letter, the way her eyes had gone dead even as she'd held herself together. He knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror for 15 years. Morning came gray and cold. The storm had passed in the night, but it had left the world transformed. The road was indeed a river of mud, impassable to any wagon. The fields were flooded in low spots. Winter had arrived overnight, and it would be days before anything dried enough for travel. Samuel was at the stove when Clara emerged from the spare room. She'd done her best to clean up, hair pinned back, dress brushed clean, face washed. But she still looked exhausted, and he noticed the way she moved carefully, like someone whose body ached in places polite people didn't mention. "Road's out," he said without preamble. "Won't be passable for at least 2 days, maybe 3. He watched her process this information, saw the flicker of dismay quickly suppressed. "I see. I don't want to impose. Already imposed. Nothing to be done about it now." He poured coffee into 2 cups, set one in front of the empty chair. Might as well eat. Breakfast was simple: eggs from his chickens, bread from the loaf he'd baked 3 days ago, butter churned from his cow's milk. He was self-sufficient by necessity and preference. Everything on this ranch he'd built or made or grown himself. Clara ate quietly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to take food for granted. When she finished, she stood and began clearing the table without asking. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She was already at the pump, filling the basin. "But I won't sit idle while I'm taking your hospitality." Samuel wanted to argue, but he recognized the set of her shoulders. Pride again. The need to be useful, to earn her keep, to not be a burden. He understood that too. "Suit yourself." He left her to it and went out to check the animals. The chickens were fine, the cow needed milking, the barn needed mucking out. Normal work, the kind that filled his days and kept his hands busy and his mind blank. Except today his mind wouldn't stay blank. He kept thinking about Clara in his house, washing his dishes, occupying space that had been empty for so long. It felt wrong, and right at the same time, disorienting, like trying to walk on a ship's deck in a storm. When he came back an hour later, the dishes were clean and drying, the floor had been swept, and the smell of fresh bread was filling the room. Clara stood at the stove, kneading dough with practiced efficiency. "Found flour and yeast in your stores," she said without looking up. "Thought I'd make a fresh loaf. The old one's going stale." Samuel hung his coat by the door. "You don't—" "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." Now she did look at him, and there was defiance in her eyes. "I won't be a kept woman, Mr. Grant, not even for a few days. If I'm eating your food and sleeping under your roof, I'll earn it." He almost smiled. Almost. "Fair enough." They moved around each other carefully for the rest of the morning, two strangers negotiating the small space. Clara worked with the quiet competence of someone who'd been in service, finding tasks that needed doing and doing them without fuss. Samuel went about his normal routine, trying to ignore the way the house felt different with someone else in it. Different, but not bad. By afternoon, the bread was baked and cooling, the stove was gleaming, and Clara had found his pile of mending in the corner. Shirts with torn seams, pants with split hems, all the small damages of daily life he'd been ignoring. "You can't sew these?" she asked, holding up a shirt. "Can when I have to. Usually don't bother." "I'll do them." She was already threading a needle. "Miss Whitmore, Clara." Clara. Her name felt strange on his tongue, intimate somehow. "You're a guest. You don't need to—" "I'm not a guest." She met his eyes, and there was something fierce in her expression. "Guests are invited. I appeared at your fence by accident, and you took me in out of decency. The least I can do is make myself useful." Samuel started to argue, then stopped. He recognized stubbornness when he saw it. He'd spent 15 years cultivating his own. "Then I'll thank you for it." She nodded and bent over the mending, her fingers moving with practiced skill. Samuel sat in his chair and watched her for longer than he should have before forcing himself to look away. The day passed. Evening came. They ate the new bread with butter and jam Clara had found in the back of the cupboard. The silence between them was less awkward now, more companionable. Or maybe Samuel was just getting used to having another person around. Dangerous thought. After dinner, Clara sat by the lamp and continued the mending. Samuel worked on accounting, tallying expenses and income from the ranch. The numbers were good. He was careful, frugal, successful by frontier standards. The ranch could support 2 people easily, more if needed. Not that it mattered. Clara would leave as soon as the road cleared. This was temporary, a brief disruption in his carefully ordered life. "May I ask you something?" Clara's voice broke the silence. Samuel looked up from his ledger. "Go ahead." "The letter. Do you have any idea who might have written it?" He'd been thinking about that himself. "Maybe. There's a man in town, Elias Monroe. He's been after me for years to remarry, says I'm wasting my life out here alone. He's the only one who'd know my business well enough to forge something like that." "A friend?" "Once. We served together in the war. He settled in Millwater after, runs the general store." Clara was quiet for a moment, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "Why would he do something like that?" "Elias believes in meddling, thinks he's helping." Samuel's voice was harder than he intended. "Thinks he knows what's best for everyone." "And what do you think is best for you, Mr. Grant?" The question caught him off guard. When was the last time anyone had asked him what he wanted, what he thought, what he needed? "I think," he said slowly, "that best is probably overrated. Safe is better, simple is better." Safe and simple. Clara tested the words. "Is that the same as happy?" "Happy's a luxury. Or a choice." He looked at her sharply. "You saying I'm choosing to be miserable?" "I'm saying we're both choosing something." She tied off a thread and reached for another shirt. "I chose to believe a letter from a stranger rather than face what was waiting for me in St. Louis. You chose to lock yourself away on this ranch rather than risk caring about anyone again. Neither of us is happy, but we're both safe. The question is whether that's enough." Samuel felt something sharp lodge in his chest. "You don't know anything about me. I know you've been alone for a long time. I know this house has a spare room with clean sheets that no one ever uses. I know you have mending piled in the corner because there's no one to care whether your clothes are torn." She gestured at the bare walls, the empty windows. "I know you've stripped this place of anything that might make you feel something. That's not safety, Mr. Grant. That's surrender. You're here 3 days and you think you can judge how I live?" "I'm not judging. I'm recognizing. Claire's voice was soft now, without anger. I see you because I am you. Different circumstances, same surrender. We're both ghosts, haunting our own lives. The words hung between them, truth sharp enough to cut. Samuel wanted to be angry, to tell her she was wrong, to order her to stop talking about things she couldn't understand. But she did understand. That was the problem. He stood abruptly. I'm going to check on the animals. It's dark. I know my own land in the dark. He grabbed his coat and went out into the cold night air, letting the door slam behind him. The stars were sharp overhead, the kind of clear sky that came after a storm. He stood there breathing hard, watching his breath fog in the lamplight spilling from the window. Inside, he could see Clara's silhouette bent over the mending, the picture of domestic peace. And he could feel the walls he'd built around himself starting to crack, feel the cold emptiness he'd cultivated starting to fill with something warm and frightening and utterly unwelcome. He'd survived 15 years by not feeling, by not wanting, by not hoping for anything more than the next day's work. Clara Whitmore had been here 3 days, and she'd already disrupted all of that. The smart thing would be to put her on the first wagon to town, give her money, wish her well, and close the door on this strange interlude, return to the emptiness that was safe and known. But Samuel stood there in the cold, looking at the light in his window, and for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't sure he wanted to be safe anymore. Buzzin'. On the third day, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went to the window. Samuel was on the porch, replacing the board she'd noticed was loose. He worked with focused intensity, the kind that said he was trying not to think about something. She knew the feeling. The night before had been awkward after his abrupt departure. He'd come back an hour later, said nothing, and gone straight to his room. This morning he'd been up before dawn, already outside when she emerged, avoiding her. She didn't blame him. She'd overstepped, said things she had no right to say. What did she know about his life, his choices? She was a stranger, an intruder brought here by accident and fraud. Clara made coffee and breakfast, the morning routine becoming familiar now. When Samuel came in, she had everything ready. He nodded his thanks but didn't meet her eyes. They ate in silence that felt different from before, heavier, loaded with things unsaid. Finally, Clara couldn't stand it anymore. I'm sorry about last night. I spoke out of turn. Samuel looked up, surprise crossing his face. No, you didn't. I had no right to You were right. He set down his coffee cup. That's what made it hard to hear. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. I've been thinking, Samuel continued, about the letter, about who sent you here. I should go to town today, confront Elias, get to the bottom of this. The road should be passable now, muddy, but a horse can make it. I'll come with you. He shook his head. You should rest. Mr. Grant, Samuel. She leaned forward. If someone did this deliberately, if it's about you and not just some scheme, then I deserve to know why I was used as a pawn. I'm coming. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Get ready then. We leave in an hour. The ride to Millwater was slow and uncomfortable. The road was a mess of mud and standing water, and Clara's mare, borrowed from Samuel's small string of horses, picked her way carefully. Samuel rode ahead on his gelding, both of them silent. Clara used the time to look at the landscape properly. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Mountains rose to the east, still white with snow. The valley spread out before them, gold with dead grass and sage. Here and there, lonely homesteads dotted the distance, smoke rising from chimneys. It was empty and vast and utterly different from St. Louis. She thought about what Samuel had said, that she was right about his surrender. She wondered if he understood that she'd been talking about herself, too. Coming west hadn't been brave. It had been running. Believing the letter hadn't been hope. It had been desperation, but maybe running was better than staying. Maybe desperation was better than giving up entirely. Millwater appeared as they crested a rise, a collection of buildings clustered along a single main street. It was bigger than Clara had expected, but still small by city standards. A church, a schoolhouse, several stores, a saloon, a hotel. People moved along the boardwalks, going about their business. Samuel led her to a store near the center of town. A sign over the door read, Monroe's General Goods. Wait here, Samuel said, dismounting. I will not. He looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. Fine, but let me do the talking. They tied the horses and went inside. The store was well stocked and tidy, with everything from dry goods to hardware to fabric. A man stood behind the counter, tallying something in a ledger. He looked up when the bell over the door rang. "Samuel! Didn't expect to see you in town today. Usually you—" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes moving to Clara. "Oh, Elias." Samuel's voice was flat. "We need to talk." Elias Monroe was a handsome man in his 40s, with silver threading through dark hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Right now, those eyes were wary. "About? About the letter you sent to a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis using my name." Elias's face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Eli. There's no one else who'd know my business well enough, no one else fool enough to think they were helping." For a long moment, Elias said nothing. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Come to the back. We shouldn't discuss this here." He led them through a door into a storage room filled with crates and barrels. Once they were private, he turned to face them. "You're Clara Whitmore, I presume?" "I am." "I'm sorry for the deception. I truly am. But Samuel—" He looked at his friend with something like desperation. "You've been dying out there for 15 years, slowly killing yourself with loneliness. I thought if I could just get someone there, someone who might understand—" "You thought you'd what?" Samuel's voice was dangerously quiet. "Trick me into marriage? Manipulate a woman into traveling 1,000 miles on false pretenses?" "I thought I'd save you." Elias's voice rose. "Margaret died 15 years ago, Samuel. 15 years. And you've been rotting in that ranch ever since, barely speaking, barely living. Someone had to do something. So you lied. You forged my name. You stole this woman's money and her hope and her safety. I paid the agency myself. Miss Whitmore's money went to her passage and arrangements just like it was supposed to." Clara found her voice. "Then why did the agency tell me Mr. Grant had paid?" Elias had the grace to look ashamed. "Because I asked them to. I thought if you believed he'd already invested in bringing you here, you'd come. And once you met him, once you saw the kind of man he is, you'd stay." "You thought I'd fall in love with a stranger because he was a good man?" Clara couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Or did you think I'd be so desperate and stranded that I'd have no choice?" "Both," Elias admitted. "I'm not proud of it. But yes, both." Samuel moved fast. One moment he was standing still, the next his fist connected with Elias's jaw, sending the man stumbling back into a crate. "You son of a bitch!" Elias touched his split lip, wincing. "I deserve that." "You deserve worse. She could have died on that road. She could have been robbed, attacked, killed, all because you thought you knew what was best for me. I know what I did was wrong. Do you?" Samuel was shaking now, years of controlled emotion finally breaking through. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Not just to her, to me as well? I've spent 15 years learning how to be alone, Eli. 15 years building a life that doesn't hurt. And you decided you had the right to tear that down because you think you know better than I do what I need. What you need is to live again. What I need is to be left alone." Samuel's voice echoed in the small room. "What I need is for people to stop thinking they can fix me, that I'm broken, that I need saving. I'm fine the way I am." "No, you're not." Elias straightened, holding his jaw. "You're existing. You're not living. There's a difference, and if Margaret could see you now, she'd be heartbroken." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Clara saw him flinch, saw the color drain from his face. "Don't," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you dare use her against me." "Then stop using her as an excuse." Elias's voice was desperate now. "She wouldn't want this for you. She wouldn't want you locked away, punishing yourself for surviving when she didn't. She'd want you to be happy. She'd want you to love again." "You don't know what she'd want." "Neither do you." "'Cause she's gone, Samuel. She's been gone for 15 years. And you can't ask her, and you can't bring her back, and you can't spend the rest of your life making yourself pay for being the one who lived." Silence fell like a shroud. Clara stood frozen, witnessing something private and raw. She felt like an intruder, But she couldn't move, couldn't break the moment. Samuel's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I know she's gone. I know I can't bring her back. But I can keep her memory sacred. I can honor what we had by not replacing her. That's not honor, Elias said gently. That's fear. You're not keeping her memory sacred. You're keeping yourself locked in the moment she died. Samuel turned away, his shoulders rigid. Clara saw him struggling, saw the war between anger and grief playing out across his body. What do you want me to say? Samuel finally asked. That you're right? That I'm broken? That I need fixing? I want you to say you're willing to try, to live, to let someone in. Elias glanced at Clara. Even if it's not her. Even if it's just opening the possibility. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Then he turned to Clara, and the look in his eyes was complex. Shame, anger, apology, all mixed together. I'm sorry you were dragged into this. Elias will give you money to get back to St. Louis, or to make a start somewhere else if you prefer. Whatever you need. Samuel, Elias started. No. Samuel's voice was firm. You've done enough. Miss Whitmore deserves compensation for what you've put her through, and I'll make sure she gets it. But this scheme of yours ends here. He walked out without another word. Clara hesitated, looking between the door and Elias. Go after him, Elias said quietly. Please. I may have done this the wrong way, but I wasn't wrong about him needing someone. He doesn't want me there. He doesn't know what he wants. He spent too long telling himself he doesn't deserve to want anything. Clara thought about that, about want and deserve, and the walls people built to protect themselves from pain. Then she straightened her shoulders and followed Samuel out into the street. He was already mounted, gathering his reins. She hurried to her horse and pulled herself into the saddle. Mr. Grant, wait. He didn't look at her. You should stay in town. I'll send your things. Elias will make sure you're taken care of. What if I don't want to stay in town? Now he did look at her, confusion crossing his face. Why would you want to come back? Because I don't have anywhere else to go. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Clara searched for the right words. And because I understand now what this was about, what Elias was trying to do. He was trying to manipulate us both. He was trying to help a friend who was hurting. He did it wrong, but the intention wasn't cruel. So you're defending him? No, I'm saying I understand the impulse. Clara guided her horse closer. Samuel, I'm not asking to be your wife. I'm not even asking to stay permanently, but that spare room has been empty for 15 years, and your mending's been piling up, and you've been alone so long you've forgotten what it's like to have someone care whether you come in from the cold. I don't need... Maybe not. But maybe I do. Her voice softened. I have nowhere to go and no money to get there. You have a ranch that could use another pair of hands and a house that's too quiet. Let me stay, on wages, as hired help. Not a bride, not a charity case. An employee. Samuel stared at her, searching her face for something. Why? Because, Clara said honestly, I'm tired of running. And maybe you're tired of hiding. Maybe we could both stop, just for a little while. See what happens when we're not so busy surviving that we forget to live. She'd thrown his own words back at him, the ones Elias had said. She saw them land, saw Samuel flinch. This is a bad idea, he said, but there was no conviction in it. Probably. You'll regret it. Maybe, but I regret a lot of things already. One more won't kill me. Despite everything, Samuel almost smiled. Almost. You're stubborn. So are you. He looked away, out at the mountains, at the road leading back to his ranch, back to the empty house and the silent rooms and the life he'd built from loneliness and grief. Wages, he finally said. Room and board. You do the cooking, cleaning, mending, whatever needs doing around the house. I handle the ranch work. We keep separate rooms, separate lives. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Agreed. And when you want to leave, you leave. No obligations, no guilt. Agreed. He nodded once sharply. Then he turned his horse and started back down the road. Clara followed, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. She'd come west looking for safety, for a home, for someone to make her matter. She'd found none of those things. Instead, she'd found a man as broken as she was, hiding in the wilderness from a pain he couldn't heal. But maybe, just maybe, two broken people could hold each other up long enough to figure out how to be whole again. Or maybe they'd just break each other worse. Either way, Clara thought as the ranch came into view, it was better than running. The first week passed in a careful dance of avoidance and necessity. Clara rose before dawn each morning, starting the fire and preparing breakfast before Samuel came in from the early chores. They ate in silence that was sometimes comfortable, sometimes charged with unspoken tension. Then he would disappear to the far reaches of the ranch while she tackled the accumulated neglect of 15 years, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned, floors that hadn't seen a good scrubbing, curtains that had never existed. She found fabric in town on her second trip there, using the small advance Samuel had given her on her wages. Plain cotton, nothing fancy, but enough to soften the stark windows and make the house feel less like a way station and more like a home. When Samuel came in that evening and saw the curtains hanging, he stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but the morning sun was blinding, and I thought—" She paused, suddenly uncertain. "If you don't like them, I can take them down." He studied the curtains for a long moment, his face unreadable. "They're fine." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it wasn't rejection either. Clara learned to read these small concessions as victories. The nights were harder. After dinner, they would retreat to opposite sides of the room, Samuel to his ledgers and accounts, Clara to her mending or reading from the small collection of books she found tucked away in a trunk. The silence would stretch between them, heavy with all the things neither of them knew how to say. Sometimes she would catch him watching her, his expression troubled. Sometimes he would catch her watching him, and she would look away quickly, embarrassed to be caught studying the lines of grief carved into his face. They were like two wild animals circling each other, neither willing to attack, neither willing to fully retreat. It was during the second week that Clara started to notice the small things he did. The way he would leave firewood stacked by the door on particularly cold mornings. The way he fixed the pump handle without comment after she mentioned it was stiff. The way he came in from working in the rain and hung his coat far from the stove so it wouldn't drip on the floor she'd just cleaned. He never acknowledged these gestures, never mentioned them. But they accumulated like snow, quiet and persistent, until Clara realized that Samuel Grant showed care through action, not words. He'd spent so long alone that he'd forgotten how to speak affection, but his hands still remembered how to express it. She began to respond in kind. Fresh coffee waiting when he came in from the cold. His favorite shirt mended and pressed. Meals time to when he finished work, not to some arbitrary schedule. They were building a language between them, one constructed entirely of small kindnesses and careful consideration. But they still barely spoke. It was Clara who finally broke the pattern. She'd been there nearly 3 weeks when she came in from feeding the chickens, a task she'd taken over without asking, to find Samuel standing in the main room, staring at something in his hands. "Samuel?" He startled, quickly putting whatever it was behind his back, but not before she caught a glimpse of a photograph in a wooden frame. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not." But his voice was rough, and he didn't move. Clara should have retreated to give him privacy. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. "May I see?" He hesitated so long she thought he would refuse. Then slowly, he brought his hands forward and held out the photograph. The woman in the picture was beautiful. Dark hair pinned up in the style of 20 years ago, intelligent eyes, a slight smile playing at her lips. She wore a nurse's uniform, and there was something capable and warm in her expression. "Margaret," Clara said softly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Samuel stared at the photograph as if seeing it for the first time. "I put all her things away years ago. Couldn't stand seeing them every day, the reminder of what I'd lost. But sometimes I take them out and wonder if I'm forgetting her face." "Are you?" "I don't know. When I look at this, I see her clearly, but when I close my eyes and try to remember, it gets harder. The details blur, and I'm terrified that one day I'll forget completely, and it'll be like she never existed at all." Clara understood that fear intimately. Her own mother had died when she was 12, and already the precise color of her eyes had faded from memory. She could remember that they were blue, but what shade? What exact blue? Tell me about her, Clara said, settling into the chair opposite him. Not about how she died, about how she lived. Samuel looked at her in surprise. Why? Because she was important to you, because she's part of who you are, and because, Clara chose her words carefully, because I think you've spent so long mourning her that you've forgotten to remember her. He sat down slowly, still holding the photograph. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. She was from Boston, educated, cultured, everything I wasn't. I was just a farm boy who'd enlisted because it seemed like the right thing to do. Got shot in the shoulder, infection set in. I was delirious for days, and she was there every time I woke up. Cool cloths on my forehead, water for my fever, steady hands changing bandages. His voice grew softer as he spoke, the rough edges smoothing into something almost tender. She had this laugh, not polite or restrained like you'd expect from a lady. It was full and genuine, the kind that made everyone around her smile too. And she was fierce. I saw her dress down a doctor twice her age for not washing his hands properly between patients. He tried to pull rank, and she just looked at him and said, "Germs don't respect rank, doctor, and neither do I." He washed his hands. Despite the sadness of the moment, Clara felt herself smile. She sounds remarkable. She was. Too remarkable for me, I always thought. But she said yes when I asked her to marry me. Said she'd come west, leave her comfortable life in Boston, start over in a place she'd never seen, just because I asked. She loved you. She must have. And I loved her so much it terrified me. I worked like a madman to build this place, to make it worthy of her. Every fence post I put in, every board I nailed, it was for her. So she'd have a home, a life, something solid and real. His hands tightened on the frame. And then she died before she could even see it, before we could marry, before any of it mattered. It mattered, Clara said firmly. Samuel, it mattered. Maybe not in the way you planned, but you built something lasting. This ranch exists because you loved her. That's not nothing. It feels like nothing. What good is a ranch without someone to share it with? What good is any of this if I'm alone? The rawness in his voice made Clara's chest ache. She wanted to reach across the space between them, to take his hand, to offer some physical comfort, but she knew instinctively that he wasn't ready for that, might never be ready. "You're not alone right now," she said instead. "I'm here." "For how long?" He looked at her, and there was something desperate in his eyes. "How long until you realize this place is a tomb and I'm a dead man walking? How long until you leave?" "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "I don't know what the future holds. But I'm here now, and that counts for something, doesn't it?" Samuel set the photograph on the table between them. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to let someone in without—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Without it destroying me when they leave. Then don't let me in." Clara met his eyes. "Keep your walls up. Keep me at a distance. But maybe you could stop pretending you don't need anyone. Maybe you could just accept that it's okay to have another person in your space, even if you don't let them into your heart. And you, what do you need?" The question surprised her. No one had asked her that in so long. Mrs. Henderson had never cared what Clara needed, only what she could provide. The agency had never asked. Even the other servants she'd worked with had been too busy surviving to worry about each other's needs. "I need to feel useful," Clara said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke. "I need to know that I'm contributing something, that my presence makes a difference. I need to not be invisible." "You're not invisible." "I've been invisible my whole life, the servant no one notices until something needs doing, the orphan no one wanted to adopt, the woman men looked through until they wanted something from her." She took a breath. "Here, when you look at me, you actually see me, even when you don't want to. That's more than I've had in years." They sat in silence, the photograph between them like a bridge or a barrier. Clara couldn't tell which. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the new curtains. "I can't promise I'll ever—" Samuel started, then stopped. "I can't promise anything. I'm not asking you to." He nodded slowly, then stood and carefully placed the photograph back in whatever trunk he'd taken it from. When he returned, his face had regained some of its usual careful blankness, but something had shifted. Some invisible wall had been acknowledged. if not torn down. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening. Thank you for telling me." They went back to their evening routine, but the silence felt different now. Less like avoidance and more like peace. That night, lying in her small bed, Clara thought about Margaret and the love that had built this ranch. She thought about Samuel, trapped in grief so old it had calcified into his bones. And she thought about herself and what she was doing here, and whether staying was brave or just another way of running. She didn't have answers, but for the first time since arriving, she felt like maybe she didn't need them yet. The next morning, Samuel was different. Not dramatically so. He still rose early, still worked hard, still said little. But when Clara put his breakfast in front of him, he said, "Thank you," and met her eyes when he said it. When he came in from the morning chores, he mentioned that one of the hens seemed ill and asked if Clara had noticed anything. Small things, but they added up to something that felt like the beginning of conversation. Clara responded carefully, not wanting to push too hard. She answered his question about the hen, mentioned that the cellar door was sticking, asked if he knew when the feed shipment was due. Normal household coordination, the kind of mundane communication that kept a working ranch functioning, but beneath it, she could feel something else building. Trust, maybe, or at least the possibility of trust. It was 3 days after their conversation about Margaret that the fever struck Clara. She woke in the night feeling wrong, hot and cold at the same time. Her head pounding, her body aching in ways that had nothing to do with work. She tried to get up to use the privy and nearly fell, her legs refusing to support her properly. She made it back to bed and pulled the quilts around her, shivering violently. Morning came, but Clara couldn't rise. The room spun when she opened her eyes. Her throat felt like broken glass. When she tried to call out, only a croak emerged. She must have slept, because the next thing she knew, Samuel was in her room. The door was open. Had she forgotten to lock it, or had he broken it down? She couldn't remember. "Clara." His voice came from very far away. "Clara, can you hear me?" She tried to answer, but the words wouldn't form. His hand touched her forehead, and even through her fever, she could tell his fingers were cool. "Christ, you're burning up." She felt him lift her, blankets and all, and carry her somewhere. The main room, she realized dimly. He settled her in his armchair, the one by the fire, and began building up the flames. Time became strange after that. She was hot, then cold, then hot again. Sometimes she saw Samuel's face hovering over hers, lined with worry. Sometimes she saw shadows that might have been memories or might have been fever dreams. She saw Mrs. Henderson's son reaching for her in a dark hallway. She saw the train journey west, endless and swaying. She saw her mother's face, which she thought she'd forgotten. Through it all, there was Samuel, his hands cooling her burning skin with damp cloths, his voice low and steady, telling her she was safe, that she'd be fine, that she just needed to hold on. His presence, constant and unwavering, an anchor in the delirium. Once she woke to find him sitting beside her chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. She tried to reach out to him, but her arm wouldn't obey. Then the fever pulled her under again. When she finally surfaced properly, the world was quiet and still. Gray morning light filtered through the curtains she'd made. Her fever had broken. She could tell by how the air felt cool against her skin instead of either scorching or freezing. Her body ached, but it was the normal ache of illness passing, not the delirium of fever. Samuel was still there, asleep in the chair he'd pulled beside hers. He looked terrible, unshaven, hollow-eyed, his clothes rumpled. How long had she been sick? How long had he been watching over her? Clara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room tilted. The movement must have made a sound because Samuel's eyes snapped open instantly, alert despite his obvious exhaustion. "Clara!" He was on his feet in an instant, one hand steadying her shoulder. "Easy. Don't try to move too fast." "What?" Her voice was a rasp. "How long?" 3 days. You've been in and out, mostly out." He reached for a cup of water on the nearby table. "Drink this, slow." The water was the best thing she'd ever tasted. She drank it too fast despite his warning and had to stop to cough, which hurt her raw throat. "Easy," he said again, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard before. Fear. Samuel Grant, who faced everything with stoic calm, had been afraid. You stayed, she said when she could speak again. Of course I stayed. You think I'd leave you alone like that? You could have sent for someone from town, a doctor, Mrs. She couldn't remember any names. Her mind was still fuzzy. The doctor came. Samuel set the cup aside. Said it was fever, probably from something you caught on the journey out here. Said all we could do was keep you cool and wait for it to break. He left medicine, but mostly you needed rest and watching. So you watched. Someone had to. But the way he said it, the way he wouldn't quite meet her eyes, told Clara it was more than duty. She thought about waking to see him with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. She thought about how his voice had sounded in her delirium, steady and constant, promising her safety. Samuel, she said softly, thank you. He finally looked at her, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch. It wasn't love. That would be too much, too soon. But it was connection, recognition. The look of someone who'd been terrified of losing something they'd only just realized they wanted to keep. You scared me, he said bluntly. I thought... He stopped, jaw working. I thought you were going to die, and I realized I didn't want you to. That somewhere in the last few weeks, I'd gotten used to you being here. That I'd started to... He cut himself off, shaking his head. Never mind. Started to what? Nothing. You need to rest. But Clara caught his hand before he could pull away. Say it. Clara! Please. He looked at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused, hers thin and fever-weak. I'd started to care. Whether you ate, whether you were warm, whether you were happy. I'd started to listen for your footsteps in the morning, to notice when you were quiet, to... He swallowed hard. To remember what it felt like to have someone that mattered. And it terrified me. Because I know how this ends. People leave. People die. And I can't... His voice broke, and Clara squeezed his hand as hard as her weakened state allowed. I'm not dead, she said. I'm right here. But you could have been. And the thought of that, of this house going back to silence, of eating alone and working alone and having no one to notice if I came in from the cold, he pulled his hand away and stood abruptly. This is why I didn't want anyone here. This is why I've stayed alone. Because caring hurts, losing hurts, and I've already lost everyone I ever cared about. Clara wanted to argue, to tell him that the risk was worth it, that isolation was worse than potential loss. But she was too tired, and he was too raw, and sometimes the truth needed time to settle before it could be spoken. Okay, she said instead. I understand. He looked at her in surprise. You do? I do. Because I feel it too. I came here expecting nothing, and somehow I found something. This place, these weeks, they've mattered. You've mattered. And that's frightening because I've learned not to count on anything lasting. But maybe... She took a breath. Maybe we don't have to decide everything right now. Maybe we can just acknowledge that we care and figure out what that means later. Samuel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Later. After you've recovered. After we've had time to think. After, Clara agreed. He brought her soup then, and bread, and she ate what she could. He helped her back to her own bed, which he'd somehow found time to change with fresh sheets. He made sure she had water nearby, that the blankets were enough but not too much, that the room was warm but not stifling. And before he left, he paused in the doorway and said, I'm glad you're all right. It was perhaps the most emotionally direct thing he'd ever said to her. Me too, Clara replied, and meant it in more ways than one. The next few days were a study in careful navigation. Clara was weak, her recovery slower than she'd have liked. Samuel hovered without hovering, leaving food where she could reach it, checking on her without fussing, finding excuses to be nearby without crowding. They didn't talk about what he'd said during her fever. By unspoken agreement, they let it rest, a truth acknowledged but not yet examined. Instead, they fell back into routine, or as much routine as possible with Clara still recovering. She graduated from bed to chair by the fire, then from chair to short walks around the house, then to light tasks, folding laundry, cutting vegetables. Samuel watched her like she might collapse at any moment, and she pretended not to notice his vigilance. It was almost a week after her fever broke that Clara felt strong enough to venture outside. The morning was cold but clear, the kind of crystalline winter day that made everything sharp and bright. She bundled up in the coat Samuel had given her, his own spare, too large but warm, and stepped out onto the porch. The world smelled clean: pine from the mountains, sage from the valley, wood smoke from the chimney. Clara breathed it in and felt something in her chest expand. She'd been so focused on surviving, on recovering, on navigating the strange space between her and Samuel, that she hadn't taken time to simply exist. She walked to the fence line, moving slowly, her legs still weak. The mountains rose in the distance, white-capped and eternal. The valley spread out before her, winter-brown but beautiful. This land was harsh, unforgiving, but it was also honest. It demanded strength and gave back exactly what you put into it. No lies, no pretense, no betrayal. She understood why Samuel had chosen this place, why he'd poured his grief and love into building something here. There was healing in this kind of honesty, in work that showed tangible results, in a life stripped down to essentials. "You're supposed to be resting." Clara turned to find Samuel approaching from the barn, carrying a bucket of something, grain or feed. She couldn't tell at this distance. "I've been resting for days. I needed air." He set down the bucket and moved to stand beside her at the fence. For a moment, they both looked out at the mountains in silence. "It's beautiful," Clara said. "It's empty." "Empty isn't the same as lonely." He glanced at her. "Isn't it? Empty is neutral, a blank canvas. Lonely is—" She searched for the words. "Lonely is when the emptiness hurts, when you notice what's missing more than what's there." "And which is this?" Clara considered. "Right now, just empty. There's space here for whatever we choose to build, or not build." Samuel turned to face her fully. "Clara, about what I said, when you were sick. You don't have to—" "Let me finish." He took a breath. "I meant it, all of it. I have started to care, but I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to—" He gestured helplessly. "How to be a person who cares about someone without it consuming everything. How to let you matter without making you my whole world. With Margaret, I loved her so completely that when she died, I died too. Just kept walking around afterward. And I can't do that again." "I'm not asking you to." "Then what are you asking?" Clara thought carefully before answering. "I'm asking if we can be friends. Real friends. The kind who talk to each other, who share meals and conversation and the occasional truth. I'm asking if we can care about each other without labels or promises or expectations. Just—" She smiled slightly. "Just be two people sharing a space, trying to figure out how to live, instead of just survive." "Friends," Samuel repeated, testing the word. "Unless you'd rather not?" "No." "Nah." He looked out at the mountains again. "I haven't had a friend in years. Don't know if I remember how." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." He nodded slowly. Then he picked up his bucket and turned back toward the barn. But before he walked away, he said, "Thank you for not asking for more than I can give." "Thank you for giving what you can," Clara replied. It was a small moment, a quiet exchange, but something had shifted between them, some agreement reached. They weren't lovers, weren't even romantically interested, but they were no longer just employer and employee, stranger and stranger. They were something new, something neither of them had quite figured out yet. And for now, that was enough. Winter deepened, and with it came a routine that was almost comfortable. Samuel taught Clara about the ranch, how to read weather signs, how to tell when the animals needed attention, how to preserve food for the lean months. Clara taught Samuel about small comforts he'd forgotten, how a properly set table made meals feel special, how music could fill empty spaces, how sometimes talking about nothing was better than silence. They played cards in the evenings, a deck Clara had found in town. Neither of them was particularly good, and they argued cheerfully over the rules. They read aloud to each other from the few books Samuel owned, agricultural manuals and old novels, poetry, and philosophy. Clara's voice was clear and expressive. Samuel's was halting, but earnest. They talked. Not about the big things, not yet, but about daily life. About Clara's childhood in various households, always the outsider. About Samuel's years in the war, the things he'd seen and done. about small dreams and large fears, hopes and disappointments, the ordinary texture of two lives slowly interweaving. They learned each other's rhythms. Samuel liked his coffee strong and black, hated onions but would eat them if they were cooked into stew. Clara was cheerful in the mornings but grew quiet by evening, needed time alone to read or think. Samuel worked best with his hands, thought through problems by building or fixing. Clara processed through talking, needed to speak ideas aloud before they made sense. They were different, but the differences complemented rather than conflicted. And slowly, carefully, they built something that neither wanted to name but both valued. It was during one of their evening card games that Samuel asked the question Clara had been dreading. "Why did you really come west?" She kept her eyes on her cards. "You know why. The agency, the letter? No, before that. You said you were running from Mr. Henderson's attention, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Clara set down her cards. She'd known this conversation would come eventually. Friendship required honesty, and she'd been holding back. "No," she admitted. "That's not the whole story." She told him then. About her mother dying when she was 12, leaving her in the care of a father who'd never wanted a daughter. About being sent to her first household at 13, too young, too vulnerable. About learning quickly that she had value only in what she could do, never in who she was. About the men who thought servant girls were there for their amusement, the women who blamed the girls for attracting attention, the system that ground people down and expected them to be grateful for it. "I've been surviving since I was 12 years old," she said. "Just surviving, never living. The agency seemed like a chance to finally have something of my own, a husband who'd chosen me, a home that couldn't be taken away. I knew it was desperate. I knew the risks. But I was so tired of being powerless, of having no say in my own life." Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're not powerless here," he finally said. "I know. That's why I stayed. Even after everything, the lie, the misunderstanding, this place feels different. You see me as a person, not a servant or a woman to be managed. You ask what I think, what I need. That's more than I've had in years. You deserve more than that." "Maybe. But it's a start." They resumed their game, but something had deepened between them. Another layer of protection removed, another truth shared. That night, Clara lay in bed and thought about power and choice. She'd stayed at the ranch by her own decision. She worked here because she wanted to, not because she had no other options. Samuel had made it clear multiple times that she could leave whenever she wished, with money and help. She'd chosen to stay. And in that choice was a kind of power she'd never had before. The thought made her smile in the darkness. Maybe she was finally learning how to live. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday morning in late February, unexpected and sharp enough to make both of them look up from breakfast. Samuel's eyes met Clara's across the table, and she saw wariness there. In the 3 months she'd been at the ranch, no one had come calling. Samuel's isolation had been deliberate and absolute. He rose slowly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, and moved to the door. Clara stayed at the table but positioned herself so she could see who stood on the porch. It was Elias Monroe. The man looked uncomfortable, hat in his hands, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Samuel, I know I'm not welcome, but I need to speak with you, both of you, if Miss Whitmore is willing." Samuel's jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. "Come in, then." Elias entered, nodding respectfully to Clara. "Miss Whitmore, I'm glad to see you're still here. I wasn't sure, after everything, if you'd stay." "I'm still here," Clara said neutrally. She wasn't sure how she felt about Elias Monroe. Anger at his manipulation, certainly, but also a strange gratitude because without his interference, she never would have found this place. This strange peace she was building with Samuel. "I came to apologize," Elias said, addressing them both. "Properly, not just in the heat of the moment. What I did was wrong. I had no right to forge that letter, to play with both your lives like that. I convinced myself I was helping, but really I was just interfering where I had no business." Samuel crossed his arms. "You could have killed her, sending a woman alone across the country on false pretenses. Anything could have happened." "I know. I've been thinking about that every day since. The danger I put Miss Whitmore in, all because I thought I knew what was best for you." Elias looked genuinely ashamed. There's no excuse for it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you both to know that I understand what I did was unforgivable. Then why come? Samuel asked. If you're not asking forgiveness, why bother? Because there's something else you should know. Elias glanced at Clara apologetically. I wasn't the only one involved. The agency I contacted, they're not legitimate. I found that out after Miss Whitmore arrived. They're running a scheme, taking money from desperate women and sending them to addresses that don't exist, or to men who never requested brides. Miss Whitmore was lucky. Some of the women— He stopped, swallowing hard. Some of them aren't so fortunate in where they end up. Clara felt her blood run cold. She thought about the other women at the agency office in St. Louis, all of them hopeful, all of them handing over their life savings for a chance at something better. How many women? I don't know exactly, but the agency's been operating for at least 2 years, could be dozens, maybe more. And you're just now telling us this? Samuel's voice was dangerous. I just found out myself, started asking questions after Miss Whitmore arrived, trying to figure out how they'd managed the whole thing. The more I dug, the worse it got. I've reported them to the authorities in St. Louis, but these things take time, and in the meantime— He looked at Clara. There's a woman coming, another one. She's expected at the Murphy Ranch next week. Expected by who? Clara asked sharply. By no one. Murphy's a widower with 3 young children, been alone for 5 years. He's a good man, but he never contacted any agency. This woman, her name's Sarah Brennan, she sold everything she has and is traveling here thinking she's going to be married and have a home and a family, just like you did, Miss Whitmore. Clara stood, her chair scraping against the floor. We have to warn her, stop her before she gets here. That's why I came. I thought— Elias looked between them. I thought maybe if Miss Whitmore wrote to her, woman to woman, explained what happened, maybe she'd listen. Maybe we could save her from making the same journey for nothing. It won't reach her in time, Samuel said. If she's due next week, she's already on the train. Then we meet her at the station, tell her the truth before she makes it all the way out to Murphy's place. Clara was already moving toward her room. I'll go. When does the train arrive? Friday afternoon. But, Miss Whitmore, you don't have to— Yes, I do. She turned to face both men. Someone should have warned me. Someone should have told me the truth before I spent 3 weeks traveling to nowhere. If I can spare this woman that, I will. Samuel looked at her for a long moment, something complicated passing across his face. Then he nodded. We'll both go. I'll drive you to town Friday. After Elias left, Samuel and Clara stood in the quiet house, the implications of what they'd learned settling over them. You don't have to do this, Samuel said finally. It's not your responsibility to fix Elias's mistakes. It's not about Elias. It's about Sarah Brennan, whoever she is. It's about all the women who came west believing in a lie. Clara moved to the window, staring out at the mountains. I was lucky, Samuel. I ended up here with you, and it's been— She paused, searching for the right word. Safe. Good. But what if I'd been sent to someone cruel? Someone who would have taken advantage of a woman with nowhere else to go? I know. His voice was quiet. I've been thinking about that too, about how easily it could have gone differently. Then you understand why I have to warn her. I do. But Clara— He moved closer, though still maintaining that careful distance they always kept between them. What happens if she has nowhere else to go? What if she's in the same position you were, desperate enough to risk everything on a lie? Clara had thought about that too. I don't know. But at least she'll know the truth. At least she can make a choice with full information. Friday came cold and gray, threatening snow. They left early, wanting to reach town in plenty of time before the train arrived. The drive was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Clara kept imagining Sarah Brennan, what she might look like, what circumstances had driven her west, what hopes she carried in her worn carpet bag. Millwater was busier than Clara had seen it before. The train only came through twice a week, and it seemed half the town turned out for each arrival. Samuel guided the wagon to a spot near the station, and they waited. The train arrived on time, belching steam and smoke into the cold air. Passengers began to disembark. A few businessmen, a family with small children, an elderly couple. And then, near the end, a woman alone. She was younger than Clara had expected, perhaps barely 20, thin, with mousy brown hair escaping from a bonnet that had seen better days. She carried a single small trunk and moved with the careful exhaustion of someone who'd been traveling for weeks. Her eyes scanned the platform, looking for someone, hope and fear warring on her face. "That's her," Clara said, though she didn't know how she knew. Maybe it was the look on the woman's face, the same desperate hope Clara had worn when she arrived. "That has to be Sarah Brennan." They approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. Clara took the lead. "Miss Brennan? Sarah Brennan?" The woman turned and her face lit up. "Yes! Are you from the Murphy family? Is Mr. Murphy here?" Clara's heart sank. "No, I'm Clara Whitmore. This is Samuel Grant. We need to speak with you about why you're here." The hope on Sarah's face began to dim. "I don't understand. Mr. Murphy was supposed to meet me. The agency said everything was arranged." "May we speak somewhere private?" Samuel gestured toward the small restaurant near the station. "We'll buy you a meal. You must be hungry after your journey." Sarah looked between them, confusion giving way to worry. "What's happened? Is Mr. Murphy all right?" "Mr. Murphy is fine," Clara said gently, "but he's not expecting you. Please, let us explain." They settled into a corner booth at the restaurant, and while Samuel ordered food, Clara told Sarah the truth. About the agency, about the forged letters, about women being sent west to men who'd never requested brides. Sarah's face went through a progression of emotions: disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a kind of hollow devastation that Clara recognized too well. "I spent everything," Sarah whispered when Clara finished. "Every penny I'd saved in 3 years. I left my position, my room, everything. The agency promised. They showed me his letter. They said he'd paid for my passage." "The letter was a forgery," Samuel said, "just like the one sent to Clara. The agency kept your money. They've been doing this to dozens of women." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for the coffee Samuel had ordered. "Then I have nothing. No money, no home, no prospects. I can't even afford a ticket back east." Clara reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "I know how you feel. I felt the exact same way 3 months ago when I arrived at Samuel's fence and learned the truth. But you're still here. You and Mr. Grant, you married anyway?" "No." Clara glanced at Samuel. "It turned out differently for me. Samuel offered me work on his ranch, wages and room. I stayed by choice, not because I had no other options." "I don't understand. If you're not married, why would he—" Sarah looked at Samuel with sudden suspicion. "What kind of arrangement do you have?" Samuel's face hardened. "The kind where I needed help around the house, and Miss Whitmore needed honest work. Nothing more. And before you judge, understand that Clara was free to leave at any time, is still free to leave. She stays because she chooses to." "I'm sorry," Sarah said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply. It's just, I've learned to be suspicious of men who offer help to desperate women. They usually want something in return." "I understand," Samuel said, his voice softening slightly. "And you're right to be cautious, but right now you need to decide what you want to do. We can try to get your money back from the agency, though it might take time. We can help you find work here in Millwater if you want to stay, or we can help you get back east if that's your preference." Sarah stared into her coffee cup. "I can't go back east. There's nothing there for me. I was a seamstress in a factory, barely making enough to eat. I took this chance because I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought maybe I could have something better. A home, a family, someone who'd chosen me. I know it sounds foolish." "It doesn't sound foolish," Clara said firmly. "It sounds human. We all want to matter to someone." They sat in silence while Sarah composed herself. The food arrived, and she ate mechanically, clearly too upset to taste it. Clara watched her and felt a strange kinship. This could have been her 3 months ago, sitting in this same restaurant, learning that her hopes were built on lies. "There might be another option," Samuel said slowly, as if thinking it through as he spoke. "The Murphy Ranch isn't far from mine. I know John Murphy. He's a good man, like Elias said. He's been struggling since his wife died, trying to work the ranch and care for 3 children. He could use help." "You mean as a servant?" Sarah said flatly. I mean as a housekeeper. Paid position, room, and board. It's not what you came here for, but it's honest work with a decent man. Does he know about this? That I'm here, that I was sent to marry him? No, and we won't tell him unless you want us to. As far as he needs to know, you're a woman looking for work, and we're recommending you based on Clara's experience. Sarah looked at Clara. Is that how it worked for you? You just became his housekeeper? Yes and no, Clara said honestly. I became his employee, but I also became his friend. Not everyone will have that experience, but Samuel's right about John Murphy. He's a good man. I've met him a few times in town. He's kind to his children, respectful to women, works hard. If you want a fresh start, you could do worse. And if I want to try something else, find different work, then we'll help you do that too, Samuel said. The choice is yours, Miss Brennan, always yours. Sarah was quiet for a long time, picking at her food. Finally, she looked up, and there was steel in her eyes that reminded Clara of herself. I want to meet him, Mr. Murphy, not as his mail-order bride, but as myself, as someone looking for work. If he needs help and I can provide it, maybe we can come to an arrangement. But I want to go into it honestly, with both of us knowing what to expect. We can arrange that, Samuel said. I'll drive out to his place this afternoon, explain that we know a woman looking for housekeeping work. If he's interested, we can bring you out tomorrow. And so it was settled. They spent the rest of the day helping Sarah get situated at the town's boarding house. Samuel paid for a week's room over Sarah's protests and making arrangements. Samuel drove out to the Murphy ranch and returned with good news. John was indeed desperate for help and would welcome a housekeeper. The next morning, they drove Sarah out to meet her potential employer. The Murphy ranch was smaller than Samuel's, but well maintained. 3 children played in the yard, 2 boys and a girl, ranging from about 5 to 10. They stopped their game to stare at the wagon. John Murphy came out onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. He was younger than Clara expected, perhaps 35, with the weathered look of a man who worked outdoors. When he saw Sarah, something in his face softened. You must be Miss Brennan. Sam said you were looking for work. Sarah climbed down from the wagon, and Clara saw her take in the children, the house, the man. I am. I have experience with housekeeping, cooking, and mending. I'm not afraid of hard work. That's good, because there's plenty of it here. John smiled, and it transformed his tired face. I won't lie to you. This place is chaos. I'm barely keeping up with the ranch work, and the house, well, you can probably imagine what it's like with 3 children and no mother. I can imagine, Sarah said, and something in her voice made Clara look closer. There was sadness there, but also longing. This woman wanted to matter to someone, wanted to be needed. Maybe the Murphy ranch could give her that, even if not in the way she'd originally expected. They negotiated terms while Clara and Samuel waited by the wagon. Wages, room and board, responsibilities. Sarah would have her own room, Sundays off, and the freedom to leave if the arrangement didn't suit her. It was all proper and businesslike, but Clara could see something else happening beneath the formal negotiations. John Murphy looked at Sarah like she was the answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to voice. And Sarah looked at the children with a hunger that went beyond simple employment. Maybe, Clara thought, some mail-order bride schemes ended up where they were supposed to, just by a different route. As they drove back to town, leaving Sarah to settle into her new position, Samuel was quiet. Clara let the silence rest between them until they were nearly home. You did a good thing today, she finally said. We did a good thing. You're the one who convinced her to give it a chance. But you offered the solution. You didn't have to help her. You could have sent her on her way with some money and been done with it. Samuel guided the horses carefully around a rough patch in the road. I kept thinking about you, about how you arrived at my fence with nowhere to go. What if I'd turned you away? What if no one had helped you? But you did help me. That's my point. You're not the isolated, closed-off man you pretend to be. Maybe not anymore, he said quietly. Maybe you've ruined me for solitude. Clara smiled. Good. They fell back into comfortable silence, but Clara's mind was working. She thought about Elias's revelation about the agency, about how many other women might be traveling west right now on false promises, about how Sarah Brennan had been lucky to have someone warn her, but how many others wouldn't be so fortunate. Samuel, she said as they pulled into the ranch yard, I want to write letters to newspapers, to authorities, anyone who'll listen, about the agency, about what they're doing. Maybe if enough people know, we can stop them from hurting more women. He set the brake and turned to look at her. That could take months, years even. These things don't change quickly. I know, but I have to try. I was powerless for so long, Samuel. Now I have the chance to use my voice for something that matters. Will you help me? He studied her face for a long moment, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. Pride, maybe. Or respect. Yes, he said finally. I'll help you. We'll start tonight. And they did. After dinner, they sat at the table with paper and pen, and Clara began to write. She told her story, the agency, the forged letter, the dangerous journey, and the fortunate outcome that could so easily have been tragedy. She wrote about Sarah Brennan and the dozens of other women who might be traveling into danger right now. She wrote about the need for regulation, for protection, for someone to care about the powerless. Samuel helped her refine the words, suggesting newspapers to send it to, people who might have influence. They worked late into the night, and when they finally stopped, Clara had a stack of letters ready to send. Thank you, she said, covering his hand with hers. He looked at their joined hands, but this time he didn't pull away. You're doing something important, something that matters. We're doing something important, she corrected. I couldn't do this without you. The letters went out the next week, carried by Samuel to the post office in town. Clara didn't expect immediate results. She knew bureaucracy and public attention moved slowly. But she felt lighter having taken action, having used her voice instead of staying silent. Life returned to its rhythm after that. But something had changed. Samuel seemed more present, more engaged. He asked Clara about her letters, about her thoughts on various topics, about her dreams for the future. They talked more, laughed more, existed together in a space that felt increasingly like partnership rather than simple cohabitation. It was during one of these conversations, nearly a month after Sarah's arrival, that Samuel brought up a subject Clara had been carefully avoiding. Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. She set down her mending. All right. Are you happy here? The question surprised her. Yes. Why do you ask? Because I want to make sure you're staying for the right reasons. Not because you feel obligated or because you have nowhere else to go, but because you actually want to be here. Clara thought carefully before answering. When I first came here, I stayed because I had no other choice. But that's not true anymore. I have wages saved now. I could leave, find another position, start over somewhere else. But I don't want to. Why not? Because this is the first place I've ever felt like myself. The first place where I'm not invisible, not powerless, not just surviving. You see me, Samuel. You listen when I talk. You value my thoughts and opinions. You've given me space to be more than just a servant or a burden. She met his eyes. I'm happy here because, for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a home. Not just a place to sleep, but an actual home. Samuel was quiet, absorbing her words. I feel the same way, he finally said. About the house, I mean. It feels like a home now instead of just a structure. And I think that's because of you. Samuel, but let me finish. He took a breath. When you first arrived, I wanted you gone. Not because of anything you did, but because I'd convinced myself that being alone was safer than caring, that emptiness was better than the risk of loss. But you were right. That night when you called this place a surrender, that's exactly what it was. I shouldn't have said that. You should have. Someone needed to. And slowly, over these months, you've been bringing this place back to life. Not just the house. Me. I've started to feel things again. To care about things beyond the next day's work. To want things. Claire's heart was beating faster. What do you want? I want you to stay. Not as an employee, not out of necessity, but because... He stopped, struggling with words. Because I can't imagine this place without you anymore. Because when I wake up, I listen for your footsteps. Because I time my work so I'll be back for meals. Because every small thing that happens during the day, my first thought is, I need to tell Clara about this. Samuel, that sounds like... I know what it sounds like, he said quietly. And I'm terrified. Because the last time I felt this way, I lost everything. But I'm more terrified of going back to the way I was before. of choosing safety over living. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I'm scared too. I've learned not to count on anything lasting. Every time I've let myself hope for something permanent, it's been taken away. Then maybe we can be scared together. He reached across the table and took her hand properly this time. Not a brief touch, but a deliberate connection. I'm not asking for promises or declarations. I'm just asking if we can acknowledge what's happening between us. If we can stop pretending this is just friendship or employment or convenience. And what is it? Clara asked softly. I don't know yet. Something new. Something neither of us has had before. He squeezed her hand gently. But something worth exploring, if you're willing. Clara looked at their joined hands, at Samuel's face with its worry and hope, at the room around them that had become home. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the lies and mistakes and desperate chances. She thought about how sometimes the wrong path led to the right place. I'm willing, she said. The smile that crossed Samuel's face was small but genuine, the first real smile she'd seen from him in all their months together. It transformed him, made him look younger, less burdened. Then we'll figure it out as we go, he said. No expectations, no timelines, just seeing where this leads. Together, Clara added. Together, he agreed. They sat there in the lamplight, hands joined across the table, and Clara felt something settle in her chest. Not quite love, not yet, but the possibility of love. The space where it could grow if given time and care and honesty. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the curtains she'd made months ago. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove, casting warm light across the room. And between them, in the joined warmth of their hands and the gentle silence of understanding, something new began to take root. The weeks that followed were both the same and entirely different. They still maintained separate rooms, still had their routines and responsibilities, but now there were small touches that hadn't been there before. Samuel's hand on her shoulder as he passed, Clara's fingers brushing his when she handed him his coffee. There were longer conversations, shared laughter, moments of comfortable silence that felt intimate rather than awkward. They were learning each other in a new way, as potential partners rather than just cohabitants. Samuel told her about his childhood on a farm in Ohio, about parents who'd worked themselves to death trying to make the land profitable. Clara told him about the orphanage after her mother died, about learning early that survival meant making herself useful. They discovered shared loves, music, though neither could play an instrument, stories, though they had few books, the particular quality of light at dawn. They discovered differences too. Samuel needed time alone to think, while Clara processed through conversation. He was methodical and careful. She was more impulsive and emotional. But the differences felt manageable, even complimentary. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Samuel said, I've been thinking about expanding the ranch, adding more cattle, maybe some sheep. With 2 people working it, we could handle more. Clara looked up from her book. You're planning for the future. I am. Is that all right? It's more than all right. She smiled. It's living instead of just surviving. You've taught me that, he said quietly. How to plan for tomorrow instead of just enduring today. You've taught me things too. How to be still. How to find peace in work. How to trust that not everything good will be taken away. They were dancing around deeper feelings, both of them aware of it, but neither quite ready to speak the words. Clara thought she might be falling in love with Samuel Grant, with his quiet strength and careful kindness, with the way he'd opened his home and slowly his heart. But she was afraid to say it, afraid that speaking it aloud might somehow break the spell. So instead, she showed it, in the way she learned to make the foods he loved, in how she mended his clothes with special care, in the small touches and gentle words that said, you matter to me, without the vulnerability of, I love you. And Samuel showed it too, in the way he built her a shelf for her growing collection of books, in how he brought her wildflowers from the meadow, in the careful way he asked about her day, really listening to her answers. They were building something together, brick by careful brick, neither wanting to rush and risk collapse, both committed to creating something lasting. It was in early April, as the snow finally began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared, that news came from St. Louis. Clara's letters had found their mark. The agency had been raided, its owners arrested. Several women had come forward with similar stories, and there was talk of prosecution, of restitution, of systemic change. "You did this," Samuel said, reading the letter that had arrived with the news. "Your words, your courage, you stopped them." Clara felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed her. "We did this. I couldn't have done it without your support." "Still, you're the one who insisted on speaking up. You're the one who gave voice to all those women who couldn't speak for themselves." He set down the letter and looked at her with such pride it made her chest ache. "You're remarkable, Clara Whitmore. I'm just someone who got lucky and wanted to help others do the same. No, you're someone who refused to stay powerless, who took control of her own story." He moved closer, and she could see emotion swimming in his eyes. "You've changed everything. This place, my life, yourself. You're not the frightened woman who arrived at my fence anymore. Neither are you the isolated man who almost sent me away." They stood there in the afternoon light, closer than they'd ever been, and Clara felt the moment stretching between them, pregnant with possibility. Samuel raised his hand slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently touched her face. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, terrifying and beautiful. Clara's heart raced, and she saw her own fear reflected in Samuel's eyes. They were both so scared of loss, of hope, of the vulnerability that came with caring, but she was tired of being scared. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. Samuel's hand trembled against her face. "I don't know how to do this, how to love someone without making them your everything." Clara covered his hand with hers. "Then we learn together. We learn how to love without consuming, how to care without losing ourselves. And if we fail, then we fail having tried. But Samuel," she leaned into his touch, "I don't think we will. I think we're both strong enough now, both whole enough, to love without destroying each other." He pulled her close then, carefully, as if she might shatter. Clara wrapped her arms around him and felt him trembling, felt 15 years of isolation and grief finally beginning to crack open. He held her like she was precious, like she was real, like she was the answer to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. They stood there in the fading light, holding each other, and Clara felt something fundamental shift. She'd come west looking for safety, for a home, for someone to make her matter. She'd found all of that, but not in the way she'd expected. She'd found it by building it herself, by choosing it, by having the courage to stay and fight for something real. When they finally pulled apart, both of them had tears on their faces. But they were smiling too, tentative and hopeful and scared and brave all at once. "So what now?" Samuel asked. Clara laughed, the sound shaky but genuine. "I have no idea. I've never done this before. The real thing, I mean. Not convenience or transaction, but actual love." "Neither have I. Not like this." He wiped his eyes roughly. "With Margaret, it was all theoretical. Letters and plans and dreams that never became reality. This is real," Clara finished. "Messy and complicated and terrifying, but real." "Real," he repeated, testing the word. Then he smiled, that rare expression that transformed his whole face. "I think I like real." "Me too," Clara said, and meant it with her whole heart. Spring came to the Utah Territory with a violence that matched its winters, transforming the Brown Valley into sudden green almost overnight. The world seemed to be waking up alongside Samuel and Clara, and there was something fitting about that synchronicity. They were learning how to be in love, how to navigate this new territory between them with all its promise and peril. Samuel had been right when he said he didn't know how to do this. He'd spent so long alone that simple intimacy felt foreign, almost dangerous. Sometimes Clara would reach for his hand and he'd tense before forcing himself to relax. Sometimes she'd see him watching her with such intensity it took her breath away, and then he'd look away quickly as if caught in something shameful. But he was trying. That was what mattered. He was trying to let her in, to trust that loving her wouldn't destroy him, to believe in a future that held more than just work and survival. Clara was trying too. Her own walls were different, but just as high. She'd spent so long making herself small, invisible, unthreatening that allowing herself to want things felt almost rebellious. She had to remind herself that it was okay to have opinions, to take up space, to expect consideration. Samuel gave her all those things freely, but accepting them required its own kind of courage. They were taking it slowly, learning each other's boundaries and comfort zones. Samuel still slept in his own room, Clara in hers. They'd agreed without discussion that they wouldn't rush toward physical intimacy, that they needed to build trust first, to create a foundation strong enough to hold everything they were becoming to each other. But there were kisses now, gentle ones, tentative, usually initiated by Clara because Samuel was still too afraid of presuming. There were embraces that lasted longer than strictly necessary. There were moments of standing close together, shoulders touching, existing in each other's space without the careful distance they'd maintained for months. It was during one of these moments, as they worked together in the garden Clara had planted behind the house, that Samuel brought up a subject Clara hadn't expected. "People in town are talking," he said, not looking at her as he turned the soil. Clara's hands stilled on the seed packets. "About us?" "About you. About how long you've been here. What our arrangement is." He glanced at her, his expression troubled. "I don't care what they think, but I care if it's making things difficult for you." "What are they saying?" "The usual small-town gossip, that you're my mistress, that I'm taking advantage of you, that you're scheming to trap me into marriage." He drove the spade into the ground with more force than necessary. All of it garbage, but poison nonetheless. Clara sat back on her heels, feeling a familiar anger rise in her chest. Of course they assume the worst. A woman living with a man she's not married to, we must be doing something scandalous. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to either of us. But Samuel, we knew this would happen. People always talk. I know, but I keep thinking... He stopped, clearly struggling with something. Clara, if we got married, it would stop the talk. Give you protection, respectability. You'd be my wife legally, not just what? She kept her voice carefully neutral, but her heart was racing. Not just the woman you're falling in love with? I am in love with you. He said it firmly, as if she doubted. But I want to make sure I'm doing this for the right reasons. Not to silence gossip or because it's expected, but because it's what we both want. Clara stood and brushed the dirt from her skirts, giving herself time to think. Marriage. She'd come west expecting it, had built her hopes around it. Then she'd learned to live without it, to find value in herself beyond being someone's wife. Now Samuel was offering it, but in a completely different context than she'd imagined. What do you want? She asked. I want you, he said simply. However I can have you. If you want to marry me, then yes, I want that. If you'd rather keep things as they are, I can live with that too. But the talk, to hell with the talk. There was heat in his voice now. I spent 15 years caring too much about what I'd lost, and not enough about what I could have. I'm not going to let other people's opinions dictate how I live now. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. You've changed so much. You changed me. He moved closer, taking her dirt-stained hands in his. Clara, I'm not asking because of gossip or convention. I'm asking because I want to build a life with you, a real one, permanent and binding. I want to know that you're not going to leave, that this is your home as much as mine. I already know that. But I want everyone else to know it too. I want people to see you and know that you're mine and I'm yours, that we chose each other. He paused, and Clara saw vulnerability flash across his face. Unless you don't want that. Unless marriage feels like a trap after everything you've been through. Clara thought about Mrs. Henderson's son, about the powerlessness she'd felt as a servant, about how marriage for women so often meant losing autonomy and choice. But she also thought about Samuel, about how he'd never tried to control her, how he valued her opinions, how he'd supported her letters and her voice and her power. I want it, she said quietly. But Samuel, I need you to understand something. If I marry you, I'm not going to become some quiet, obedient wife who lives in your shadow. I'm still going to have opinions and speak my mind and fight for things I believe in. I wouldn't want you any other way. And I'm not going to stop being myself just because there's a ring on my finger. Clara, he pulled her closer, his eyes serious. I fell in love with who you are. Strong and stubborn and fierce. Why would I want to change that? She searched his face for any sign of doubt or reservation and found none. Then yes, I'll marry you. The smile that broke across Samuel's face was like sunrise, brilliant and transforming. He picked her up and spun her around, something so uncharacteristically exuberant that Clara laughed in pure surprise. When he set her down, he kissed her properly for the first time, not the gentle tentative kisses they'd shared before, but something deeper, more certain. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I want to do this right. Court you properly. Give you time to be sure. I'm already sure. Even so, you deserve better than a rushed decision in a garden. Let me, He paused, clearly thinking. Let me take you to dinner in town. Let me ask your permission properly, like a gentleman. Let people see that I value you enough to do this correctly. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the thoughtfulness. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. I'm not doing it for them. I'm doing it for you and for me, because I want to remember this, want to know that I did everything I could to show you how much this means. So the next Saturday, Samuel drove Clara into Millwater dressed in his best suit, she in the nicest dress she'd been able to make from fabric he'd insisted on buying. They went to the hotel restaurant, the fanciest establishment in town, and Samuel ordered them a proper meal with wine and dessert. People stared, of course. The rumors had been flying for weeks, and here they were, confirming that something was indeed happening between the reclusive rancher and his mysterious housekeeper. Clara could hear the whispers, see the speculative looks, but Samuel kept his attention focused entirely on her, asking about her day, her thoughts on expanding the garden, whether she'd heard back from the women's advocacy group she'd been corresponding with. He treated her like she mattered, like her words had weight, like she was someone worth listening to. And Clara realized that this was what love looked like for them. Not grand gestures or flowery speeches, but genuine interest and respect. Samuel loved her mind as much as anything else, and that was rarer and more precious than romance. After dinner, as they walked along the main street in the fading light, Samuel stopped at a bench overlooking the valley. Sit with me a moment? Clara sat, and he took her hand, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been all evening. I don't have a ring yet, he said. I'll get one, but I wanted to ask you first, properly, before I presumed. He took a breath. Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because of gossip or convenience or because you have nowhere else to go, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you. Yes, Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Samuel Grant, I will marry you. He kissed her then, right there on the main street where anyone could see, and Clara didn't care who was watching. She was choosing this, choosing him, and for the first time in her life she was choosing from a place of power rather than desperation. The walk back to the wagon was interrupted by Elias Monroe stepping out of his store. He looked between them, taking in their linked hands and glowing faces, and a genuine smile crossed his features. I heard you two were in town, he said. Looking happy, if I may say so. You may, Samuel said, and there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been there the last time they'd spoken. We're getting married. Well, I'll be damned, Elias laughed. I suppose my meddling worked out after all. Don't take too much credit, Clara said, but she was smiling. We got here despite your interference, not because of it. Fair enough. But Miss Whitmore, Clara, I am glad. Truly. You've been good for him. Better than I could have hoped. Samuel's hand tightened on Clara's. I know I've been angry with you, Eli, and I had every right to be. What you did was wrong. I know it was. But Clara and I talked about it, and we've decided that we can't build a future while holding on to anger from the past. So I'm telling you now, I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry that weight anymore. Elias looked genuinely moved. Thank you, Sam. That means more than you know. Just don't ever do anything like that again, to anyone. I won't. You have my word. Elias glanced at Clara. And congratulations to you both. When's the wedding? We haven't decided yet, Clara said. Soon, I think. Neither of us sees the point in waiting. They parted on good terms, and as Samuel helped Clara into the wagon, she felt another weight lift. Forgiveness, she was learning, wasn't about letting people off the hook. It was about refusing to let past wrongs poison future happiness. The ride home was quiet but comfortable. Clara leaned against Samuel's shoulder, watching the stars emerge as darkness fell. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the lies and desperation, the fear and uncertainty. She thought about arriving at Samuel's fence with nothing but hope and finding something she hadn't even known to hope for. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked softly. "About how strange life is. How the worst thing that happened to me, being sent here on a lie, turned into the best thing. If that agency had been legitimate, if I'd been matched with someone who actually wanted a wife, I'd be living a completely different life right now." "Do you ever wonder what that life would have been like?" Clara considered. "Sometimes. But I think I'd have always felt like I was living a role, being what someone else needed rather than being myself. With you, I get to be Clara, all of me, even the parts that aren't convenient or easy. Even the stubborn parts? Especially the stubborn parts." She smiled against his shoulder. "You know, when I first arrived, I thought the best I could hope for was safety. A roof over my head, enough to eat, work that wasn't degrading. I never imagined I could have this: partnership, respect, love. I didn't know I was allowed to want those things. You're allowed to want anything, Clara. You're allowed to demand anything. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." They arrived home to find a lantern burning in the window. Clara had left it there that morning, a small domestic gesture that made the house look welcoming. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, and they stood for a moment in the yard, looking at the house that would soon officially be theirs together. "I want to add a room," Samuel said suddenly. "Make the place bigger, more comfortable. Maybe add a real parlor, expand the kitchen, make it worthy of you." "It's already worthy. It's home." "Still, I want to build something together. Our house, not just the house I built for a ghost." Clara understood what he was saying. This was about more than carpentry. It was about creating something new, leaving the past behind while honoring it. Margaret would always be part of Samuel's story, but she didn't have to be the end of it. "Then let's build," Clara said. "Let's make this place ours." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of planning. They decided on a simple wedding at the small church in Millwater, with just a few people present. Sarah Brennan and John Murphy, who'd struck up their own tentative courtship, would be there. Elias, of course. The preacher and a few of Samuel's business acquaintances. Clara made her own wedding dress, simple white cotton with careful embroidery. Samuel ordered a ring from a jeweler in Salt Lake City, a plain gold band that felt solid and real on Clara's finger when it arrived. They planned a small celebration at the ranch afterward. Nothing elaborate, just good food and good company. But underneath the practical preparations, there were deeper currents running. Samuel still struggled sometimes with his fear of loss, would wake in the night convinced something would happen to take Clara away. Clara still had moments of feeling like she was taking up too much space, asking for too much, being too much. They talked through these moments, learning to voice their fears instead of letting them fester. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes the conversations turned into arguments, both of them raw and defensive. But they always came back together, always chose to work through it rather than retreat into familiar isolation. It was during one of these more difficult conversations, about 2 weeks before the wedding, that the real test came. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner discussing wedding details when Samuel said something that made Clara go still. "I was thinking we should invite Margaret's sister. She's in Denver now, married with children. We've written a few times over the years, and I think she'd want to know I'm moving forward." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You want your first wife's sister at our wedding?" "Margaret wasn't my wife. She never got the chance to be. But yes, I'd like Elizabeth to be there. She's the closest thing to family I have left from that time." "And you don't think that might be awkward? Having a living reminder of the woman you loved at our wedding?" Samuel's face hardened. "Margaret was part of my life. She always will be. I'm not going to pretend she didn't exist just to make things more comfortable." "I'm not asking you to pretend anything. But Samuel, this is our wedding, our beginning. Do we really need to have your past so prominently present?" "She's not my past. The love I had for her is part of who I am. If you can't accept that—" "I do accept it." Clara's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "I've never asked you to forget her or stop honoring her memory. But there's a difference between honoring and—" She stopped, trying to find the right words, "and making our wedding about her. That's not what I'm doing." "Isn't it? Samuel, be honest. Are you inviting Elizabeth because she's important to you now, or because you feel guilty about moving on? The question landed like a stone in still water. Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. That's not fair. Maybe not. But it's true, isn't it? You're still carrying guilt about surviving when Margaret didn't, about loving again when she can't. And you think having her sister there will somehow absolve you of that guilt. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Clara stood too, facing him across the table. Samuel, I understand guilt. I understand survivor's shame, but you can't marry me while still trying to make peace with a ghost. You have to choose. Either you're moving forward with me, or you're still living in the past. You can't do both. I'm not asking to do both. I'm asking to honor someone who is important to me while also building a future with you. Why is that so impossible? Because it's our wedding day. Because I shouldn't have to compete with a dead woman for prominence at my own wedding. The words hung in the air, harsh and cutting. Clara saw Samuel flinch as if she'd struck him, saw hurt and anger war across his face. Is that what you think? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. That you're competing with her? I don't want to compete with her. But you keep holding her up as this perfect, idealized love, and how am I supposed to measure up to a memory? I've never compared you to Margaret. You don't have to say it. I can see it in your eyes sometimes when you look at me. You're wondering if she would have done things differently, if she would have been better, if I'm enough to fill the space she left. Samuel's hands clenched on the table edge. That's in your head, Clara. Your own insecurity, not anything I've done. Is it? Then why do you still sleep with her photograph next to your bed? Why do you visit her grave every month? Why? Clara's voice broke. Why do I feel like I'm always going to be second best? The silence that followed was devastating. Samuel stared at her, and Clara saw the moment he realized she was right, that he had been holding back, keeping part of himself separate and sacrosanct. I don't know how to let her go, he finally said, and his voice was raw with pain. She was my first love, Clara. She died before we had a chance at a life together. How do I just move past that? I'm not asking you to move past it. I'm asking you to move forward from it. There's a difference. Clara moved around the table, forcing herself to approach despite wanting to retreat. Samuel, I know I can't replace Margaret. I know what you had with her was real and important. But I need to know that what we have is real and important too. Not second place, not a consolation prize, not just you settling because she's gone. It's not like that. Then what is it like? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like you're trying to build a new life while keeping one foot planted firmly in the old one. And I don't know if I can live like that. The threat was unspoken but clear. Choose to be present with me or I walk away. Samuel's face went pale. You'd leave? Over this? I'd leave before I became another thing you resent. Before I turned into the woman who made you give up your perfect memory. Yes, Samuel, I'd leave. Because I won't settle for half your heart when I'm offering you all of mine. They stared at each other across the small distance, everything between them suddenly fragile and uncertain. This was the crisis point, Clara realized. This was where they either broke or became stronger. Samuel moved first. He crossed to the shelf where he kept personal items and took down the photograph he'd shown Clara months ago. He stared at it for a long moment, his thumb tracing Margaret's face through the glass. She was 26 when this was taken, he said quietly. Just finished her nursing training. So proud, so ready to change the world. She wrote to me about her dreams, hospitals that treated everyone regardless of their ability to pay, training programs for women who wanted to be doctors, not just nurses. She had these big, impossible dreams. Clara said nothing, just watched him hold this piece of his past. When she died, I felt like those dreams died with her. Like the world had lost something irreplaceable. And I was angry. At God. At the war. At myself for surviving when she didn't. So I came here and built walls, literal and metaphorical. Told myself that if I never cared about anything again, I'd never have to feel that kind of loss. He set the photograph on the table between them. But then you showed up at my fence, and slowly, bit by bit, you broke through every wall I'd built. You made me care again, made me hope again, made me believe that maybe I deserved a second chance at happiness. His eyes met hers, filled with tears. And that terrifies me, Clara. Because losing Margaret nearly destroyed me. If I lost you, you can't live your life afraid of loss, Clara said gently. That's not living, that's just existing. I know, but knowing it and believing it are different things. He picked up the photograph again. You're right that I've been holding on to guilt, that I've been treating Margaret's memory like something sacred I had to protect. But the truth is, he stopped, swallowing hard. The truth is, I've been using her memory as an excuse not to fully commit to you, because if I hold back a part of myself, if I keep loving her, then maybe it won't hurt as much if I lose you. Samuel, let me finish. I see now how unfair that is to you, how it makes you feel like you're competing with a ghost. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Clara. You deserve all of me, not just the parts I'm willing to risk. He looked at the photograph one more time, then walked to his room. Clara heard him opening the trunk where he kept Margaret's things. When he returned, his hands were empty. I put it away, he said. All of it. Not because I'm forgetting her or erasing her from my life, but because I'm choosing to move forward. I'm choosing you, Clara, fully and completely. No more holding back, no more keeping one foot in the past, just us, if you'll still have me. Clara felt tears streaming down her face. She'd been prepared for a fight, for resistance, for him to choose his comfortable grief over uncomfortable growth. She hadn't expected this. Raw honesty, genuine change, the courage to let go. Of course I'll still have you, she said, moving into his arms. I love you, all of you, including the parts that carry grief and guilt and fear. But I need you to be present with me, Samuel. I need you to choose this life we're building every day. I will, he promised, holding her tight. I am. And as for Margaret's sister, you're right. This is our day, our beginning. I'll write to Elizabeth and let her know I'm getting married, but we don't need to have her there. This day is about us, about our future, not about my past. Clara pulled back enough to see his face. We can invite her if she's truly important to you, just not because you feel guilty, not as some kind of penance, only if she's genuinely part of your life now. Samuel considered, then shook his head. She's not. I've been holding on to that connection out of obligation, not genuine affection. You were right to call me on it. I'm done living for ghosts, Clara. I want to live for you, for us. They held each other in the lamplight, and Clara felt something fundamental shift. This wasn't the end of Samuel's grief. That would probably never fully end. But it was the end of letting that grief control his present. He'd made a choice, and in making it, he'd shown Clara that their love was real, was primary, was worth fighting for. Thank you, she whispered against his chest, for choosing me, for being brave enough to let go. Thank you for demanding it, for not settling for less than you deserve, for loving me enough to fight for us. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the quiet house. Outside, the spring night was full of sound, frogs calling, wind in the new leaves, the distant call of an owl. Life continuing, moving forward, refusing to stay static, just like them. The wedding was 2 weeks later, on a bright May morning when the valley was green and the mountains were still white-capped in the distance. Clara wore her simple white dress with wildflowers in her hair. Samuel wore his best suit and looked at her like she'd hung the stars. The ceremony was brief and sincere. Sarah stood as Clara's witness, tears streaming down her face. Elias stood for Samuel, pride evident in his expression. John Murphy's children served as flower girl and ring bearers, taking their duties with adorable seriousness. When the preacher asked if they took each other, both Samuel and Clara answered with firm, clear voices. No hesitation, no doubt. Just choice and commitment, and the courage to build something new. The kiss was sweet and genuine, and when they turned to face the small gathering as husband and wife, Clara felt something settle deep in her soul. This was real. This was hers. This was home. The celebration at the ranch afterward was simple but joyful. Sarah had helped Clara prepare food in advance, and they laid out a feast on tables in the yard. People ate and drank and laughed, and for the first time in 15 years, Samuel Grant's ranch felt alive with happiness instead of heavy with grief. As the sun began to set and guests started to leave, Samuel pulled Clara aside. They walked to the fence line, to the exact spot where she'd first stood months ago, dirty and desperate and running out of hope. I keep thinking about that day, Samuel said, how close I came to sending you away, how different everything would be if I had. But you didn't. Because of a storm, because I wasn't quite heartless enough to turn you out into bad weather, the smallest mercy, and it changed everything. Clara leaned against him, watching the sun paint the mountains gold. Maybe that's how the best things happen. Not through grand plans or perfect circumstances, but through small mercies and unexpected chances. And stubborn women who refuse to give up. And wounded men who are brave enough to try again. They stood there as darkness fell and stars emerged, two people who'd been broken in different ways finding wholeness together. Behind them, the house glowed with lamplight, warm and welcoming. Their house now, their home, built on honesty and choice and the kind of love that chose to grow rather than stay safe. Thank you, Samuel said softly, for coming to my fence that day, for staying, for demanding better from me than I thought I could give, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Thank you for letting me in, Claire replied, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for giving me space to become who I'm meant to be, for building a life with me instead of just offering shelter. They kissed then, husband and wife under the emerging stars, and Clara thought about journeys and destinations and how sometimes the wrong path led to the right place. She'd come west as a mail-order bride meant for no one and found something infinitely better than what she'd been seeking. She'd found herself. And in finding herself, she'd found home. The first month of marriage was an adjustment neither of them had fully anticipated. It wasn't the sharing of space. They'd been doing that for months already. It was the intimacy of permanence, the knowledge that this wasn't temporary, that they'd chosen each other for keeps. Small things took on new weight. A disagreement about how to arrange the furniture wasn't just a difference of opinion. It was their first married argument. A quiet evening reading together wasn't just companionship. It was building a lifetime of shared moments. Samuel was adjusting to having someone in his bed after 15 years of sleeping alone. Clara was adjusting to being wanted there, to physical intimacy that came from love rather than duty or survival. They were gentle with each other, patient, learning through trial and error what brought comfort and what caused discomfort. There were awkward moments, times when Samuel would retreat into old patterns of silence and Clara would have to coax him back out. Times when Clara would default to making herself small and Samuel would have to remind her she was allowed to take up space. But they were learning, both of them, how to be married people instead of isolated survivors. It was 6 weeks after the wedding that Clara first suspected something had changed in a fundamental way. She woke feeling queasy, had to rush outside to be sick in the bushes. Samuel found her there, pale and trembling, and immediately wanted to ride for the doctor. "I'm fine," Clara insisted. "Just something I ate, probably." But it happened again the next morning, and the next. By the fourth day, Clara couldn't deny what her body was telling her. She'd seen enough women go through this in the households where she'd worked. She knew the signs. She was pregnant. The realization brought a complicated swirl of emotions. Joy, certainly. She'd always wanted children, had dreamed of having a family of her own, but also fear. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, even with a doctor nearby. Women died in childbirth all the time, and Clara couldn't help but think of Margaret, who died of fever, but could just as easily have died bringing a child into the world. Samuel would be thinking of that too, she knew. Would be remembering his first love, his first loss, and projecting all those fears onto Clara. She waited until she was certain before telling him. Nearly 2 weeks of morning sickness that gradually faded to a persistent queasiness, of exhaustion that had her falling asleep in her chair after dinner, of subtle changes to her body that she recognized even if no one else would yet. She chose a quiet evening after a particularly good dinner to share the news. They were sitting by the fire, Samuel working on his accounts, while Clara mended one of his shirts. The domestic peace of the moment felt right somehow, safe enough to hold something this big. "Samuel," she said, setting down her mending, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, always attuned to shifts in her tone. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually." She took a breath, suddenly nervous despite knowing how he'd react. "I'm pregnant." The look that crossed Samuel's face was complex, joy and terror in equal measure. He set down his pen carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might break something. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. But yes, I'm sure. All the signs are there." He was quiet for a long moment, and Clara watched emotions play across his face. She saw the joy trying to break through, saw the fear holding it back. "Samuel," she said gently, "talk to me. Tell me what you're thinking." "I'm thinking—" His voice cracked and he had to start over. "I'm thinking I'm terrified. Childbirth is dangerous, Clara. Women die. Good women, strong women, they die. And I can't—" He stopped, pressing his hands against his face. "I can't lose you. I can't." Clara moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. "You're not going to lose me. I'm strong, Samuel. I'm healthy. And we'll get the doctor out here ahead of time, make sure everything's prepared." That's what Margaret's commanding officer said, that she was healthy, that the fever would pass, and then she died anyway. "I'm not Margaret," Clara said firmly. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But Samuel, we can't live our lives in fear of what might happen. We have to trust that we'll be okay." "How? How do you have that kind of faith after everything you've been through?" Clara thought about that. "Because the alternative is never living at all. Never taking risks, never hoping for anything, never letting ourselves be happy because we're too afraid of losing it. That's not a life I want, and I don't think it's one you want either. Not anymore." Samuel pulled her up into his lap, holding her carefully as if she were already fragile. "I want this baby," he said against her hair. "I want our family, but I'm so afraid." "Then be afraid, but be happy too. Be excited. Let yourself feel all of it." She pulled back to look at him. "We're having a baby, Samuel. A little person who's part of you and part of me. That's terrifying and amazing, and we get to do it together." A smile finally broke through his fear, tentative but real. "A baby. We're having a baby. We are." He placed his hand on her stomach, which was still flat but wouldn't be for much longer. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I'm your father, and I promise I'm going to do everything I can to keep you and your mother safe." Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks. "We're going to be a family." "We already are," Samuel said. "But yes, a bigger one. A louder one, probably." "Definitely louder." They sat there by the fire, wrapped in each other and the knowledge of the life growing between them. It wasn't the ending Clara had imagined when she first came west. It was better, messier and more complicated and infinitely more real. The next months were a study in contradictions. Clara had never felt more alive and more exhausted at the same time. Her body changed in ways that fascinated and sometimes alarmed her. Samuel hovered, overprotective and anxious, until Clara had to sit him down and explain that she was pregnant, not dying, and needed him to treat her like a capable adult, not an invalid. "But what if something happens?" he'd argued. "What if you're doing too much, straining yourself?" "Then I'll stop and rest. Samuel, I need to keep living my life. I can't spend 9 months sitting in a chair while you do everything." The doctor said to be sensible, not to become a ghost in my own house. I'll be careful, I promise. But you have to trust me to know my own limits." It was hard for him. Clara could see the fear that lived just beneath the surface, ready to surge up at the slightest concern. But he tried. When she insisted on continuing to cook and clean and tend the garden, he let her, though he watched her constantly for signs of fatigue. When she wanted to ride into town, he insisted on driving her but didn't try to prevent the trip. They were negotiating a new balance, learning how to be partners in this too. Sarah and John Murphy visited regularly, and Sarah's presence was a comfort. She'd helped with births before and shared practical advice that made Clara feel more prepared. John and Samuel would talk about ranch business while the women discussed pregnancy symptoms and nursery preparations, and there was something settling about the normalcy of it. "You're glowing," Sarah said one afternoon as they worked together on baby clothes. "I know that's what everyone says, but it's true. You look happy." "I am happy. Terrified, but happy. That's normal. Every first-time mother is terrified." Sarah's needle flashed in the sunlight. "But you have something I didn't have with my first. A husband who loves you and will support you through it." Clara looked at her curiously. This was the first time Sarah had mentioned a previous child. Your first? Sarah's hand stilled on the fabric. I had a baby when I was 17. The father was, well, he wasn't interested in being a father. My family was ashamed, sent me away to have the baby in secret. A girl. They took her from me the day she was born, gave her to a couple who could raise her properly. Her voice was carefully neutral, but Clara heard the pain beneath. That's why I came west. Why I was desperate enough to believe a letter from a stranger. I thought maybe I could have a second chance at the family I'd lost. Sarah, I'm so sorry. Don't be. I've made peace with it mostly. And I found something here I didn't expect. John and his children, a chance to be a mother to kids who need one. It's different than I imagined, but it's real. She smiled. That's what I'm learning. Sometimes life gives you what you need instead of what you wanted, and it turns out to be better. Clara thought about that as she worked. She'd wanted security when she came west, a husband to provide for her, a home that couldn't be taken away. She'd gotten all of that, but not in the way she'd expected. She'd gotten partnership instead of provision, choice instead of security, love instead of convenience. And now she was getting a family. The baby arrived on a cold November evening, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Clara's water broke while she was making dinner, and Samuel went pale as death when he saw the fluid on the floor. It's happening, Clara said, trying to stay calm despite the sudden clench of fear in her chest. Samuel, you need to get the doctor, now. He seemed frozen, staring at her as if she might disappear. Clara. Now, Samuel, I need you to focus. Get the doctor and get Sarah. Can you do that? The direct command seemed to break through his panic. He grabbed his coat and ran for the barn, and Clara heard him ride out at a gallop. She stood in the kitchen, feeling the first real contraction hit, and realized she was about to do one of the most dangerous things a woman could do on the frontier. But she wasn't alone. Samuel would bring help. And in the meantime, she had work to do. She managed to get clean linens laid out on the bed, to get water boiling, to prepare the things the doctor would need. Between contractions, she moved through the house with purpose, using the tasks to keep panic at bay. This was happening. Her baby was coming, and she would be strong enough to bring her child safely into the world. Samuel returned within the hour with both the doctor and Sarah, his horse lathered from the hard ride. The doctor, a competent man in his 50s who'd delivered more babies than he could count, took immediate charge, examining Clara and declaring that everything was progressing normally, if quickly. First babies usually take longer, he said, but this one seems eager to meet the world. How are you feeling, Mrs. Grant? Like there's a person trying to push their way out of me, Clara said through gritted teeth as another contraction hit. That's because there is. You're doing fine. Sarah here will help you through it, and I'll be right here if anything goes wrong. But I don't think it will. You're strong and healthy, and this baby has a good heartbeat. Samuel hovered in the doorway, looking like he might be sick. Sarah gently pushed him out. Go wait in the other room. This is no place for men. But Clara, we'll be fine, Clara managed to say. Go, Samuel. I'll call for you when it's over. He went reluctantly, and Clara could hear him pacing in the main room like a caged animal. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him not to worry, but another contraction took all her attention. What followed was hours of the hardest work Clara had ever done. Sarah held her hand and encouraged her. The doctor monitored her progress and gave calm instructions. And Clara labored, her body doing work it had been designed for, but that no preparation could make easy. She thought she might die. In the worst moments, when the pain was overwhelming and her strength was flagging, she understood viscerally why so many women didn't survive this. It was brutal, primal, pushing her to the very edge of what she could endure. But she thought of Samuel in the next room, thought of the baby she was bringing into the world, thought of everything she'd survived to get to this moment. She hadn't come this far to give up now. One more push, the doctor said. Come on, Mrs. Grant, one more big push and you'll meet your baby. Clara bore down with everything she had left, and suddenly there was relief and a cry, a tiny, indignant wail that was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. It's a girl, the doctor announced, holding up a small, squirming bundle. A healthy baby girl. Sarah was crying, the doctor was smiling, and Clara felt tears streaming down her own face as they placed the baby on her chest. She was perfect, tiny and red and furious at being evicted from her warm home, but absolutely perfect. "Samuel," Clara called, her voice hoarse. "Samuel, come meet your daughter." He appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears, and crossed the room in 3 strides. He stared down at the baby in Clara's arms, this tiny person they'd made together, and Clara watched his face transform with wonder. "She's so small," he whispered. "She's perfect," Clara said. "Look at her, Samuel. Look at what we made." He touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and she immediately grasped it with surprising strength. Samuel made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I'm your father, and this is your mother, who's the bravest person I've ever known. Welcome to the world." The baby stopped crying at the sound of his voice, her unfocused eyes trying to find the source. Clara felt her heart expand in a way she hadn't known was possible. This was her family, this tiny person and this broken man who'd learned to be whole again. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. "What should we name her?" Samuel asked. Clara had been thinking about this for months. "I was thinking, if you don't mind, maybe Hope, because she represents everything we hoped for but thought we'd lost." Samuel's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Hope. It's perfect. Hope Grant." He kissed Clara's forehead gently. "Thank you for being so brave, for giving me this, for—" His voice broke. "For coming to my fence that day and refusing to leave." "Best mistake I ever made," Clara said, echoing words they'd said to each other before. "Best mistake I ever let in," Samuel replied. The doctor finished his work and declared both mother and baby healthy. Sarah helped Clara get cleaned up and comfortable. And then, finally, they were left alone. Samuel and Clara and baby Hope, a family born from lies and mistakes and the courage to build something real from broken pieces. The next weeks were exhausting and joyful in equal measure. Hope was a good baby, but she was still a baby, with all the crying and feeding and changing that entailed. Clara was recovering from childbirth, Samuel was adjusting to fatherhood, and neither of them was getting much sleep. But it was the sweetest exhaustion Clara had ever known. Watching Samuel hold his daughter, singing to her in his rough voice, talking to her about the ranch and the mountains and all the things he'd teach her when she was older, it filled something in Clara she hadn't known was empty. And watching him with Hope, seeing the gentleness and devotion he showed their daughter, Clara fell even more deeply in love with her husband. This was the man she'd glimpsed beneath the grief and isolation. The man who'd been waiting all these years for a reason to return to the world. When Hope was 3 weeks old, Sarah and John visited with their own news. They'd gotten married in a quiet ceremony the week before and wanted to share their joy with the friends who'd brought them together. "Congratulations," Clara said, embracing Sarah carefully with Hope nestled between them. "I'm so happy for you." "We're happy for ourselves," Sarah said, laughing. Who knew a forged letter would lead to this? "2 marriages and 2 babies," John added, grinning at Samuel. "Not bad for a scheme that wasn't supposed to work." They celebrated together, these 2 couples built from desperate chances and unexpected grace. They talked about the children growing up together, about helping each other through the hard frontier winters, about building lives and families and futures. As the sun set and their friends departed, Clara stood on the porch with Hope in her arms and Samuel's arm around her shoulders. The valley stretched before them, gold in the fading light, beautiful and harsh, and home. "Do you ever think about it?" Samuel asked quietly. "About what your life would have been if the letter had been real, if you'd been matched with someone who actually wanted a wife?" Clara thought about that. "Sometimes, but I don't think I'd have been as happy. Whoever that man was, he wouldn't have been you. He wouldn't have given me space to find myself, wouldn't have respected my voice, wouldn't have become my partner instead of just my husband. I didn't give you much choice at first." "No, but you gave me something better, the freedom to choose to stay. And I chose you, Samuel. Every day since then I've chosen you, this life, this home, this family. I choose all of it." Hope stirred in her arms, making the small sounds babies make. Samuel reached over and stroked his daughter's cheek with one calloused finger. I chose you too, he said. The day you arrived at my fence, I could have sent you away. Even after the storm, I could have driven you to town and never looked back. But something made me offer you work, made me let you stay. I think some part of me knew, even then, that you were going to change everything. Was I really supposed to change things, or were you just lonely? Both, maybe. But Clara, he turned to face her fully. You didn't just fill a loneliness. You showed me I'd been living wrong, that survival isn't the same as living, that safety isn't worth the cost if it means never risking anything. You taught me how to be alive again. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You taught me things too, how to have a voice, how to take up space, how to believe I deserved good things instead of just being grateful for scraps. We taught each other, Samuel. That's what partnership is. They stood there as darkness fell, 3 people against the vast frontier, and Clara thought about journeys and destinations and the strange paths that led to home. She thought about the agency that had defrauded her, about the forged letter that had sent her west, about all the mistakes and lies that had somehow led to this perfect moment. I wrote to the authorities again, she said, about the agency. They finally recovered enough money to send restitution to some of the women who were defrauded. That's good. Justice, finally. Better than justice. They're using my letters as evidence to create regulations, to prevent this from happening to other women. My words are actually changing things, Samuel. They're making a difference. Pride shone in his eyes. Of course they are. You're remarkable, Clara Grant. Always have been. So are you. You just forgot for a while. He laughed softly. Fair point. They went inside as the first stars appeared, into the house that had been empty for so long and was now filled with life. Samuel built up the fire while Clara settled hope in the cradle he'd made. Beautiful work, carved with care and love. The baby settled immediately, her tiny fist curled against her cheek. She looks like you, Samuel said, staring down at his daughter. She has your stubborn chin. God help us all then, Clara laughed, and the sound filled the room with warmth. She moved to stand beside her husband, both of them looking down at the tiny person they'd created together. Hope represented everything they'd thought they'd lost, the ability to trust, to love, to hope for more than just survival. She was proof that broken people could create something whole, that mistakes could lead to miracles, that sometimes the wrong path was exactly right. Thank you, Clara said softly. For what? For letting me in that day, for letting me stay, for building this life with me. She leaned against him, feeling his solid warmth, for choosing to live again. Samuel wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. Thank you for refusing to give up on me, for demanding better, for loving me enough to fight for us. They stood there in the quiet house, watching their daughter sleep, and Clara felt complete in a way she never had before. She'd come west as a mail-order bride meant for no one, desperate and powerless, and running out of hope. She'd found betrayal and lies and a future that looked nothing like what she'd imagined. But she'd also found herself, found her voice and her strength and her capacity to build instead of just survive. Found a partner who saw her as an equal, who valued her mind as much as her presence, who'd grown alongside her instead of trying to shape her into something convenient. Found love, not the fairy tale kind promised in agency letters, but the real kind built on honesty and respect and the courage to be vulnerable. The kind that survived arguments and fears and the hard work of actually knowing another person. Found home, not just a house or a place, but a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. A space where she could be fully herself without apology or shame. The fire crackled, and outside the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and coming snow. Winter would be here soon, harsh and unforgiving as always, but inside this house were warmth and light and the sound of a baby's gentle breathing. Inside was everything that mattered. I love you, Clara said, the words still new enough to feel momentous every time she spoke them. I love you too, Samuel replied and kissed the top of her head. Both of you, my wife and my daughter, my family. His family. Clara's heart swelled at the words. She had a family now. People who were hers and who claimed her as theirs, not through convenience or desperation or fraud, but through choice, through the daily decision to show up, to try, to build something lasting from imperfect materials. She thought about writing this story someday, about sharing it with Hope when she was older, about how her mother had come west on a lie and found truth, had been powerless and discovered strength, had been invisible and learned to be seen, about how her father had been locked in grief and found the courage to live again, about how two broken people had somehow managed to build something whole. It was a better story than any the agency could have written. Messier, certainly, more complicated and less predictable, but real in a way that mattered, real in a way that would last. Hope stirred in her sleep, and Clara watched Samuel immediately move closer to the cradle, ready to comfort his daughter at the first sign of need. He was going to be a good father, she realized. He'd already proven he could be a good partner. The same patience and respect he showed Clara, he would show their daughter. He would teach Hope that she was valuable, that her voice mattered, that she deserved to take up space in the world. And Clara would teach her daughter to be strong, to refuse to make herself small, to demand the life she wanted instead of accepting whatever crumbs the world offered. She would teach Hope that mistakes weren't the end of the world, that sometimes the wrong path led to the right place, that courage meant trying even when you were terrified. Together, they would raise a daughter who knew she was loved, who believed in her own worth, who understood that home was something you built, not something you were given. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked softly. "The future. All the things we're going to teach her. All the adventures we're going to have as a family." "I thought I didn't have a future," Samuel said quietly. "After Margaret died, I thought my life was essentially over, that I'd just be going through motions until I died. But now," he gestured at the room, at Hope, at Clara. "Now I can't imagine what comes next, and that's exciting instead of terrifying. We'll figure it out together." "Together," he agreed. They sat down in front of the fire, Clara leaning against Samuel's chest, both of them watching their daughter sleep. The house creaked and settled around them, familiar sounds that spoke of permanence and belonging. This was their home now, truly and completely. Not just Samuel's ranch that Clara occupied, but their shared space, their family home, the foundation for everything they would build. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and silent in the darkness. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. And between them, Hope slept peacefully, unaware that she was the culmination of the most unlikely love story, one built on forgery and fraud, on desperate chances and stubborn courage, on two people who'd learned to stop running from life and start running toward it. Clara closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her husband's heartbeat, the crackle of the fire, the soft breathing of her daughter. This was what peace sounded like. This was what home felt like. This was what happened when you refused to give up, when you demanded more from life than just survival, when you had the courage to build something real from broken pieces. She'd come to Utah Territory looking for safety and found so much more. She'd come as a mail-order bride meant for no one and became a wife, a mother, a partner, a voice for the voiceless. She'd come powerless and discovered her own strength. She'd come invisible and learned to be seen. Most of all, she'd come alone and found family. And that, Clara thought as sleep began to claim her, was worth every lie, every mistake, every desperate gamble that had brought her to this moment. Sometimes the wrong letter delivered exactly the right life. Sometimes mistakes were the best things that ever happened. Sometimes love found you, not despite the chaos, but because of it. Samuel's arms tightened around her, and Clara smiled against his chest. They'd made it. Through grief and fear and all the obstacles life had thrown at them. They'd made it to the other side, not unscathed but whole in a way that mattered. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over the snow-covered valley, they'd wake up and do it all again. They'd feed the baby and tend the animals and work the ranch and build their life, one ordinary day at a time. They'd argue and laugh and struggle and triumph. They'd be imperfect and human and beautifully, wonderfully alive. But for now, in this perfect moment, they were simply together, a family forged from impossible circumstances, bound by choice rather than necessity, stronger for having been broken and brave enough to heal. The fire burned low. The snow continued to fall. And in a small ranch house in the Utah Territory, 3 people slept peacefully. A man who'd learned to live again, a woman who'd found her voice, and a baby girl who represented every hope they'd thought was lost. Sometimes, Clara thought, in that space between waking and sleeping, the greatest love stories aren't the ones that go according to plan. They're the ones that survive despite the plan falling apart. They're the ones built from mistakes and second chances and the courage to try again. They're the ones that teach you what love really means. Not perfection or ease, but showing up every day and choosing each other, again and again and again. And as Clara drifted into sleep, held safe in her husband's arms, she knew with absolute certainty that she would choose this life, this love, this family, every single day for the rest of her life. She'd come west on a lie and found her truth. And that truth was simple and profound and worth every hard mile of the journey. She was home. She was loved. She was enough. And that was everything.